Brodrick, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 23, written by L. Moor, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Chapter 1. An obnoxious ringtone pulled Larkin out of a thick, black pudding of sleep. She opened her eyes. The screen of her new cell was lit up, and the thing was vibrating its way toward the edge of the nightstand. The time, shining on her ceiling like a bat signal, said 3:20 a.m.
This is it.
Awake now, she reached for the phone while she rolled to the edge of the bed and got her feet on the floor. Her hands shook a little as she tried to unlock the screen.
Hello?
She said as she got it to her ear.
Hello? Hello. Is this Dr. Nash?
This was it. Her first official call.
Yes, this is Larkin Nash.
Dr. Nash just wasn't a comfortable thing to wear yet. She'd had her PhD for all of a week.
This is Melanie Cottrell, a nurse here at Laundry Medical Center, eh?
The woman on the phone had a pronounced Minnesota accent.
Dr. Rentmeister said you'd be filling in for him tonight, since he's tied up at the MSH.
She snorted.
Well, not tied up, I guess. That doesn't sound good, does it? But you know what I mean.
The MSH was the Minnesota Security Hospital, a 100-bed facility for the mentally ill who'd committed dangerous crimes. So yeah, being tied up there wasn't something to joke about.
Yes,
Larkin said.
I'm covering for Rentmeister. I'm sorry to call you out of the middle of the night, eh? But the sheriff is here with a cop killer needs evaluated, you know, so he can get the guy locked away nice and tight before he gets shot. Sad, though, really. Wait until you see him.
Larkin ended the call as quickly as she could and jumped in the shower to wake herself up. From her little house at Bay Lake, it would still take her 30 minutes to reach the Landry Hospital if she took the 18.
Wait until you see him.
Had the nurse been talking about the prisoner or the sheriff? The clear image of her handsome sheriff boyfriend popped into her mind and made her shiver. Goose pimples lifted her skin, and she told herself it was only because she had accidentally bumped the temperamental valve and turned the shower cold, not because she was freaking out. She quickly cut the water off and grabbed one of her thin, ancient towels to get some friction started on her arms. She needed to get moving anyway. She put her half-wet hair into a tight ponytail, dried off, and tried to keep her mind on getting on the road, and not who might be waiting at the end of it.
Which sheriff? What if it's Justice?
The possibility made her queasy. She'd been dating Justice Payette, the sheriff of Mille-Lacs County, for 2 months, and since the hospital sat in Crow Wing County, the nurse might have been talking about her local sheriff and not one of the 4 men from bordering counties. But still, the chances of it being Justice were only 1 in 5. Maybe if she hadn't been in such a hurry, the woman would have volunteered the information. Of course, Larkin could have asked. Why hadn't she asked? Anyone else would have been excited by the 20% chance of meeting their boyfriend on the job site, but not her. She was under enough pressure answering this first call without worrying what Justice would think of her. They had a strange relationship already, and she didn't want to make it stranger still by keeping a professional distance just when he'd started talking about taking the next step, whatever that was supposed to be. She ignored another wave of nausea as she put on her new grey shoes with the woven backs. Not only did they go well with her slightly darker grey slacks, they made her taller, and taller people won more respect automatically, didn't they? Besides, if there was ever a time she wanted instant respect, It was on her first doctor call, possibly placed by her attractive, powerful, what in the hell is he doing with me, boyfriend.
Please don't be Justice. Please don't be Justice.
As she flipped through hangers of old clothes, looking for her blazer, she wondered what she would say when she saw him, if she saw him.
Hey, babe, surprise. What are you doing here? Gah.
She was going to sound stupid no matter what. She communicated better with perfect strangers than she did with Justice. They talked around things, talked about other people, the world in general. They spent a lot of time with other couples, all deputies and their wives or girlfriends, so they would have someone to chat with, or she and Justice watched movies in silence. He kissed her hello, he kissed her goodbye. They'd made out exactly twice, but both times it happened with the clock ticking, minutes before Tommy, his deputy, was due to show up, and then again when he'd been about to leave for a night shift. But even though they weren't getting any chummier, he hadn't seemed to mind. At least he kept calling, kept coming back. When he talked about taking the next step, her boss, Felix Rentmeister, had been standing beside them, and though Rent had acted as if he understood, she hadn't had a clue. She took 10 seconds to throw on some mascara and told herself she needed it whether or not Justice would see her that night. There was a chance he was still in Minneapolis, where he'd been in meetings for the past week. He'd had to miss all the celebrating when she'd received her doctorate. Okay, so he'd missed a cupcake and a chick flick. How else would she have celebrated on her own? He'd warned her that dating a lawman would mean they wouldn't share a lot of things other couples shared, but she'd insisted she didn't mind. After all, he was the first steady date she'd had since before grad school, and most of the time she felt like he was the first mature man who'd ever asked her out. 32 was mature, right? And mature men had mature jobs. Why would she mind? He tried not to talk about his job. She didn't talk about her patients or her work. In the beginning, he joked about their professional paths probably crossing one day. After all, she worked with some mentally disturbed people, and so did he. But he was all about locking them away from the world, while her job was to get patients back out into it. And now that she had her doctorate and could start her own clinic, she would be able to help a lot more people. But since their professional goals were pretty much at odds, they'd decided that it was best not to talk much about them. No use trying to win over the opposing team, he'd said. Then he'd warned her that one day she'd come face to face with some truly dangerous characters, and she'd come over to his side. That she'd be the one begging him to lock some guy up before he could hurt anyone else, and he'd promised not to rub her nose in it when it happened. I won't say I told you so. Then he'd winked, and she'd melted a little. A wink from him always worked that way, and he knew it, leaving her feeling like a popsicle left on a hot sidewalk. She opened the car door, jumped in, and patted her pocket to make sure she'd remembered her driver's license and a wad of cash. With a landlady like hers, she didn't dare leave $1 lying around, let alone her entire paycheck. She knew it was stupid not to deposit it until she opened a new account, but the idea of holding $6,000 in her hands just for a day or two had been too tempting to resist. She'd also been tempted to spread the bills out on her bed and roll around on them, but she hadn't given in, yet. With the hundreds folded in half, it didn't make too large of a bump, thank goodness, and a pat on her blazer assured her the weight of her phone was where it should be. Yes, she should take a purse, but doctors didn't carry purses, right? Right? And no one was going to pick her pants pocket if she couldn't get her own fingers in there. 10 minutes she'd spent getting ready, Not bad, considering she'd been dead asleep. But she was awake now. In no time, she was on the 18 headed west. The hospital sat halfway between Brainerd and Braxton, just north of the crossroads of 317 and the 215. The surrounding communities were small, but in a medical emergency, Minneapolis was just too far away for a lot of folks. Those butterflies stirred up again, warning her that somewhere up ahead, Justice Payette was waiting for her. Dating him wasn't as easy as she would have liked, but so what? Handsome men, professionals with their heads on straight, who also happened to be interested in her. Well, she wouldn't say they were hard to find because she'd found one. One. She just wasn't in any hurry to see him. Chapter 2. Sitting in her 20-year-old Honda in the parking garage of the Landry Medical Center, Larkin took a couple of minutes to calm down. She'd never been to a yoga class, but she knew enough to take some slow, deep breaths and try not to think about what a big deal this job was for her.
Just a job. I'm ready for this. Just a job. Get in, get out, and get home to bed.
5 minutes came and went. She'd done all she could. Time to rock and roll. She climbed out of her car and looked around, alert for dangerous types. Looking cool was one thing. Ignoring the shadows in a nearly empty parking garage in the middle of the night was another. Besides, she'd heard enough from disturbed patients to know where they liked to hide. And though the hospital garage was well lit, with little black cameras here and there, along with emergency call boxes, she wouldn't take any chances. She laced her fingers between her wad of keys and made her own version of brass knuckles, then headed for the elevator. A thick rubber mat grabbed onto one of her new heels, and she nearly toughed it, but recovered in time to stay on her feet. The elevator doors opened, and 2 nurses caught her mid-lunge, but they didn't miss a beat in their conversation. Larkin figured at 3 in the morning they were probably way too tired to care if there was a chick doing aerobics in the garage, as long as she didn't get in their way. Larkin stumbled into the elevator and took another deep breath.
No one saw that. No one at all. I'm just a professional coming on a call. I'm a professional. I look professional. I know my stuff. Okay, so I know a lot, and I can fake the rest. There is someone in that hospital that needs me, and I'm going to help them. And if I can help them, I will get them to someone who can.
Dr. Larkin Nash to the rescue. The medical center sat on a hill above and behind the parking garage, so she punched the number 3 button, hospital level. The doors reopened, however, and a man in tattered, colourless clothes stumbled inside with her. He glanced at her, rolled his eyes, and hunched forward. His back spasmed twice, like he was having some kind of seizure. She held out her hands so she could catch him if he started to fall.
Are you all right?
She couldn't tell if he was breathing, but since he was still on his feet, she figured he wasn't in too bad of shape. And if she was lucky, there would be a nurse nearby when the doors opened again.
Just hang on,
she told him. His back jerked again, and the most unwelcome sound in the world filled the elevator, along with the even less welcome stench of vomit. But it wasn't the smell that got her. It was the warm, wet feeling seeping through the open toe of a new expensive shoe. The man straightened and faced her with wet, grinning lips. "Yeah, honey, I'm all right now." She was still frozen in horror when the doors opened, and if not for the fresh air wafting in when the guy walked out, she might still have been frozen in place, holding her breath when they closed again. She'd recovered just in time and hobbled out onto the walkway while holding up an endangered pant leg. With her other hand, she patted her pocket to make sure the square lump of money was still there, and it was. Yeah, she should have deposited that paycheck. The hospital doors were still another 50 feet away, with nothing in between she might wipe her shoe on, not even a little stretch of grass. The landscape was full of poky little bushes that said, "Keep off." The sick man staggered through the doors far ahead of her, and she hoped that when she got inside, everyone would assume the smell came from him. She just had to find a restroom fast and clean up before she went to the crisis unit. Hopefully, she could resist throwing up herself. A janitor passed her, pushing a mop handle that steered his rolling yellow bucket toward the elevator, the paper mask dangling around his neck, and the disgust on his face told her he knew what was waiting for him. The giant revolving doors had been turned off for the night, so she pushed through the smaller door. Still hobbling and trying to spare her pant leg, she came across 2 security guards smirking at a bank of monitors. One of the guards stepped out from behind his desk and threw his arms wide in an awkward pose, with one foot in the air behind him. Ta-da! It was a perfect replica of her own pose after she'd caught her heel on the mat in the garage. Apparently, all those little black cameras were in working order, which was probably why the janitor was so prepared. And even if her acrobatics hadn't impressed the nurses, they'd at least impressed someone. "Not your night, is it?" said the second guard. She shook her head.
If they had to call me, it means someone else has it a lot worse.
Both guys sobered. "Who called you?"
Crisis unit. You want to tell me how I find it?
She'd been there a couple of times with Rent, but after being in so many different hospitals and clinics, sometimes they all blended together. "7th floor, those elevators to your right. Turn left when you step out." She nodded.
And a restroom?
The second man pointed across the hall.
Thank you.
With as much dignity as she could summon, she limped calmly to the ladies' room. She had to be all out of bad luck, she thought, until she finally looked down at her shoe. Without missing a beat, she walked to the garbage can, pulled out the liner, and continued on to the big stall on the end. The seat was up. Thankfully, the toilet had just been cleaned. Problem was, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and she was out of smooth moves, so she lifted her knee and set her new shoe, along with her murky toes, into the bowl. And for the next 5 minutes, she alternated between puking in the trash liner and pushing the little black flush button. Chapter 3. Hospital socks. Nothing was as instantly humbling as hospital socks, unless it was a hospital gown that never closed in the back. But at that moment, Larkin might as well have been wearing one of those too. She'd paid $135 for those stunning grey shoes to celebrate her new job, signing bonus, and impressive paychecks to come, an extravagance she had never indulged in before because she'd never been able to. But life would be different now, and the shoes were a great way to show the world that she was part of it. She'd gotten her slacks off the sale rack, and her trendy paisley blazer was a cast-off from an old roommate, but the shoes had made her feel like she just walked off the set of a makeover show. And even if there'd been no one to see her complete ensemble, except for a couple of tired nurses in a parking garage, that memory would have to last her. She was back to her thrown-together self as she pushed the security button outside the doors to the crisis unit, feeling a whole lot smaller than her lack of famous footwear accounted for. "May I help you?" asked a man's voice.
I'm Dr. Nash. Nurse Cottrell called me. I'm covering for Dr. Rentmeister.
"All right," he said, then buzzed her in. Of course they noticed the socks first. A skinny guy in scrubs with a nurse ID and a guard with a stained tie stood at the security desk waiting to secure her cell phone and any personal items that might be used by a patient to harm himself or others. She didn't offer her belt. The guard didn't ask for it. After all, if belts weren't allowed, there were a lot of men in that wing, including the guard, who would lose their pants. They both frowned at her feet, then looked up at her face like they expected her to confess she wasn't a doctor after all.
Yes,
She said.
I am a doctor, not a patient. I just had a wardrobe malfunction with my shoes.
Shoes that she'd been unable to clean. And in the end, she'd tossed them both into the giant barf bag to make sure she wouldn't be tempted to rescue them. She would just pretend she'd never bought them in the first place.
Someone sent for a psychologist?
The guard pointed to an open doorway behind him. From inside, she heard a familiar voice. Deputy Tommy Nowick's, to be precise, and her stomach dropped. "I've got bad news and worse news," he said. "What?" Justice didn't sound happy. "The bad news is, Rent sent a woman to evaluate our guy." "Oh, that's just great. And she's your girlfriend." A loud bang made her jump along with the guard and the male nurse. She had to give Justice some credit. He hadn't cursed. But whatever he hit it hard enough to make him suck air after he hit it. She'd been tempted to walk through the door to keep him from saying something he might regret her hearing, but she decided to wait it out, at least long enough for his hand to stop stinging. "Larkin," Justice called tentatively. She could imagine him closing his eyes and praying she wasn't there.
Yeah?
Okay, so then he cursed. Tommy came to the doorway and nodded for her to come inside. He looked about as pleased to see her as she'd been to hear his voice, but that made no sense at all. Granted, Justice was a bit of a male chauvinist at times, but he was also well educated and intelligent enough to know that a woman could do most jobs as well as a man, and many of them better. She took a step toward the doorway, and the guard looked like he was about to restrain her for her own safety, so she gave him a wink and a quick headshake, then stepped through. Justice was already walking toward her with a repentant grimace for a smile. She grimaced back. "Congratulations on your graduation," he said, then took hold of her upper arms and dropped a kiss on her forehead. She kept her chin down so he wouldn't kiss her lips and taste puke on her breath. "And congratulations on the new job. I didn't know Rent was already throwing you in the ring. I guess I thought you'd take a big vacation first." She shrugged and bit her tongue. Justice never took a day off, let alone a week, long enough to really go somewhere and have some fun. So what fun would it be to go on vacation alone? Tommy patted her awkwardly on the shoulder. "Yeah, congratulations." But he kept frowning at Justice.
I can't stand the suspense,
she said.
"Why don't you want a woman to evaluate your prisoner?"
Justice squatted a bit to stare straight into her eyes, demanding her complete attention. "He's not just a suspect, honey. He killed Sheriff Reiser. We were there."
"Robert?"
Justice nodded, then pulled her against him for a brief squeeze, like he expected her to fall apart. Robert Reiser was the sheriff of Cass County. Larkin and Justice had been to a lawn party at his home. She'd met all 4 of his children and had thought that she and Robert's wife, Anna, might become good friends one day if she and Justice remained together.
Poor Anna,
she whispered. Maybe we should have Melanie call someone else. It's not like we can remain impartial at a time like this. Larkin shook her head and blinked away the tears forming in her eyes.
No, you don't need to call anyone else. I can do this. Besides, who knows how long it might take to get someone else here?
She has a point, Tommy said. And we want to get this guy locked away, before too many lawmen find out what he's done. Justice nodded, stared at her for a full 10 seconds, then nodded again. All right, Princess. Let's get this over with. I'll tell you what happened, and you won't have to worry about speaking with the prisoner. You just prescribe.
Hang on,
she said.
I will need to speak to him. I can't possibly know what's going on in his head unless I do. And I can't help him if I don't know what he's thinking.
Tommy took a nervous step toward a door at his back. It had a small observation window in it. Obviously, the patient suspect was on the other side of it, and Tommy was trying to put himself between her and the danger. It was sweet, really, but she wasn't there to be protected. Or at least, that's what she thought, until she saw the raw anger on Justice's face.
I don't understand,
she said.
Tell me what's wrong.
His jaw jumped a couple of times. You're not here to help him, Larkin. You're here to help us get him put away. You just write a prescription for Haldol.
Justice, I'm a doctor of psychology.
I don't give a rat's ass what you are.
Not the kind of doctor that can write prescriptions.
She pretended she hadn't heard the rest of what he'd said. After all, one of his friends had just been killed, and he'd apparently been a witness to it. It was understandable for his emotions to be a little wild. She'd be a fool to take it personally. He sighed. You can't. She shook her head and wiggled her arms to signal he needed to loosen his grip, which he did. Then he rubbed them in apology.
I can make a recommendation to the ER doctor, though, and he can write a prescription.
Justice finally smiled. That will work.
But I can't do that unless I evaluate him first.
She tilted her head.
And I can't give an honest recommendation without an honest evaluation.
Justice's jaw twitched again, and he stepped back quickly, like he thought he might hurt her if he stayed where he was. She chalked that up to the trauma he'd been through as well, but inside, her little Jiminy Cricket of a conscience recorded the moment in his little notebook.
Don't worry. The second I am sure he's a danger to himself or anyone else, I'll get out fast.
Tommy looked through the little window. That means we'll have to restrain him.
He's not restrained?
Justice frowned. He was. She quick-stepped over to the window before he could stop her, then nudged Tommy out of the way. As soon as she realized what she was seeing, she started laughing. Chapter 4. Though she tried not to have preconceived ideas about patients, especially before she met them, she admitted that the man pacing the room like a giant cougar wasn't what she had expected. But now she knew why Justice hadn't wanted a woman looking him over. He was an ancient Scottish god, complete with a blue and green plaid kilt, long hair, and a vest that looked like a bunch of animal skins sewn together. It was caught against his body by leather straps that no longer held any weapons. A metal sheath had no sword handle sticking out the top, and smaller leather holsters were empty too. As he paced back and forth in the small space, his hair and the loose ends of that vest swayed like they were alive.
You need to remove all those leather straps,
she said, not taking her eyes off him.
and the laces out of his boots. And if that plaid is all one long piece, like it looks, you're going to have to make him change out of it."
She stopped speaking when she turned and saw the flush and frustration on Tommy's face.
"What?"
He hesitated, stared at the floor. "When we tase him, it only lasts a few seconds. We got his weapons the first time. It took 2 to get him into the car." She looked again at the beast in the cage. He didn't look the least bit subdued.
"How many times have you tased him?"
Tommy lifted a hand and started counting on his fingers, then lifted his other hand. Justice leaned close so he could watch the prisoner with her through the little window. 16, he said next to her ear.
16?
She'd allowed herself to be tased once so she would be able to relate to difficult patients who had experienced it. She couldn't imagine going through it twice in a lifetime, let alone 16 in one day.
It might have been kinder to shoot him.
Tommy nodded. "We tried." Justice's arm reached around Larkin to slap Tommy in the side of the head. "Really?" He tried to slap him again, but Tommy moved out of reach. "Of course we didn't shoot him. You see any blood?" Tommy bit his lip for a second, then forced a laugh. "I was just kidding, Larkin. We never tried to shoot him." She nodded and smiled like she believed him. But then she looked back at the Scottish god and wondered. "You remember that Highlander movie?" Justice spoke quietly next to her ear again. She might have mistaken it for affection if she hadn't known his attention was fixed on his prisoner and not her. "This guy thinks he's the real deal. Chopped off Reiser's head, too, or at least he tried to."
"Please,"
she said in her doctor tone, and held up a hand to insist he move back.
"let me speak to him. I'll find out if he's delusional. What is his name?"
Tommy opened his mouth to answer, but after a glance at Justice, he clapped it shut again. "Hasn't said a word." Justice stepped back and pointed to the intercom installed below the little window. "Go ahead and try, but unless you want him tased again so we can restrain him, you'll have to use that." She nodded, motioned for Tommy to give her some space, then pressed the little black button.
"Sir?"
The beast god stopped pacing immediately and looked at the door. His eyes bore into hers while he waited. His chest lifted the vest and the sash of plaid with every breath, but he was calm in spite of his pacing.
"Sir, my name is Dr. Nash. I would like to come in there and talk to you, to get this all sorted out. But these officers are concerned for my safety, so I'm going to need you to sit down at the table and allow them to restrain your arms. It is the only way they will allow me to speak to you."
He frowned for a couple of seconds, then spoke in a language she couldn't identify. It sounded a little German, a little Dutch, and a whole lot of something else.
"Must be Gaelic,"
she guessed.
"I don't suppose there's anyone in the hospital that speaks Gaelic?"
Tommy pushed in front of her and pressed the button. "Do you speak English?" The god spoke again. This time it sounded like he'd repeated the word English, but he sort of growled it, then spit on the floor. Larkin sighed.
"We're going to need a translator."
While Justice paced like a caged and grumpy lion, Larkin tracked down a woman in human resources. As it turned out, a janitor named Russia, originally from Peru, spoke Gaelic. He also spoke 6 other languages, including Mandarin Chinese. Why he was a janitor in Minnesota was anyone's guess. But 10 minutes later, Larkin laid out her problem again, which was translated sentence by sentence through the intercom.
"My name is Dr. Nash. I would like to come in there and talk to you to get this all sorted out, but these officers are concerned for my safety. I need you to sit down at the table and allow them to restrain your arms. It is the only way they will allow me to speak to you."
The janitor translated it all. After a minute of considering, the ancient god nodded and moved to the table. He sat in the chair and laid his forearms on the surface next to metal loops that could be used with handcuffs. Then he waited. "Remember," Justice murmured, "he's a killer. His fate is sealed, and he knows it. He'll say anything to escape." She, Justice, and Russia waited with anticipation, while two security guards entered the little room and moved cautiously toward the table. Through the intercom, the interpreter repeated a few phrases in soothing tones. The suspect watched the guards with narrowed eyes. He didn't trust them. Understandable, considering. Larkin's heart leapt the second she realized that the Scottish god had changed his mind. His jaw jumped. His gaze glanced at the gun on the hip of one guard, while that man's attention was on his handcuffs. The other guard reached for his own weapon.
"Tell him not to do it,"
she told the translator, but it was too late. Russia was already running for the outer door. She feared everyone would be hurt if she didn't try to intervene, so she pulled the observation door open, stepped inside, and held her hands out to her sides.
"Everyone relax."
The suspect knocked the gun out of the first guard's holster, caught it, then threw it across the room where it landed behind the undisturbed bed. He shoved the second guard backward and took his gun from him before he could catch his balance. That gun landed near the first one while the first guard was spun in a circle. When he stopped, his hands were cuffed together. He ran toward Larkin and the open door, but the towering prisoner appeared behind him and caught him on the shoulder. Back at the table, the second guard was struggling, trying to free his cuffed hands from the table. Too late, Larkin backed toward the door. Someone, perhaps Justice, grabbed her hand, but he let go when the first guard was pushed through the opening between them, breaking their grip. The prisoner stepped close. An urgent but gentle push of his hand turned her, and she was suddenly walking forward, out through the open door, with the Scottish god pressed up against her back.
"Relax,"
she repeated as she shuffled quickly through the room. No one was hurt yet. No need for panic yet. The first guard raised his still-cuffed hands in a plea for Justice to unlock them, but the sheriff shoved him out of the way and aimed a taser. The Scotsman moved Larkin between them, but continued through the room, pulling her along by the back of her thin belt.
"Why didn't I give up the belt?"
Tommy raised his gun, but it looked like he was aiming at her head. She squeaked and her hands raised automatically to protect her face. "That won't do any good," Justice told him. Then he aimed his taser at her. She could imagine what he was thinking, that if he tased her, the prisoner would feel it. But what would she feel? He grimaced, like he knew he was going to regret it. His slight shrug told her he had no choice.
"Don't you dare!"
Justice looked like he was still considering it when the next door closed between them. Nurses backed away down the hall with their mouths hanging open. The imposing warrior pulled on her again, this time spinning her around to face forward, and together they pushed through the doors that led them out of the crisis unit. The alarm sounded too late. The unit was locked down with Justice and the others trapped inside. But at that moment she was almost relieved. At least her boyfriend couldn't tase her. It was embarrassing, really, this brain delay, when it finally occurred to her that she had run from one danger only to find herself knee-deep in something even more perilous. If she had been thinking clearly, would she have thought to struggle? to keep the Scotsman from dragging her out of there, because now she was a hostage. If she had never opened that door to try to intervene, her eyes closed and she groaned, fairly certain she had just lost her what in the hell is he doing with me boyfriend, and she was pretty sure she'd been added to a list of doctors to never call, even in an emergency. If the folks at Landry Medical Centre didn't have a list like that already, they would now. A two-toned alarm sounded overhead to warn that the hospital was locking down. The crisis unit doors flew open just as she and the prisoner reached the bend. As they turned, she strained to see beyond the big body. Tommy had his gun drawn again. Justice had the taser in one hand and his gun in the other. She was going to die, all because she'd opened that door. The grip on her arm was suddenly gone. The Scotsman had slowed and turned back. If she was smart, she would run. But the elevators were right there. She could duck inside one. She punched the call button and stepped up close, praying while she watched, feeling like a little girl who just wanted to shut her eyes until it was over. But there would be reports to fill out. Someone would want to know how it had all gone south, and since it was all her fault, the least she could do was keep her eyes open. The prisoner would be shot, probably killed, and it was all on her. Without weapons to defend himself, the guy unbuckled one of the belts from his shoulder and stretched it between his hands. Tommy lunged to the far left, his arms straight, 2 hands on his weapon, but he suddenly twisted when the long leather loop caught on his hands and pulled him to the side, turning his gun on Justice, who had to jump back when he saw the danger. The gun went off. The bullet hit the corner of the wall with a snap. The loop rolled out again, catching Justice's weapons and turning them in the opposite direction, toward Tommy. The end of the taser flew out at him, catching the deputy in the chest. A bell dinged over Larkin's head. The doors slid apart. The Scotsman spun in a wide circle, his kilt flying out around him like a little girl's bell skirt. But Justice ignored Tommy's convulsing body and aimed his gun at the prisoner, trying to keep him in his sights while he spun away. A shot rang out, deafening in the short hallway. The Scotsman stiffened, stumbled, then righted himself again. She was given no time to think, no time to panic, no time to enjoy the numbing bliss of shock as she was shoved inside the elevator. The door closed just as Justice came into view. There was no time for eye contact, which she was grateful for. He looked furious. Her captor pressed a button. There was no hitch in his movements, no blood dripping, no pain on his face. She guessed the shot hadn't hit him after all. Her years of study kicked in like a backup generator, and she felt herself slipping into comfortable skin. She was the doctor. He was the patient.
Don't do this,
she said carefully, hoping he could understand her intent, if not her words.
Let me help you.
He looked surprised. Then he smirked. Nay, lassie, allow me to help ye. Chapter 5. I'll ask you to step away from the door, lass. It wasn't the brogue that got her to move to the back of the elevator. It wasn't the charming way he held his hand up to his face and wiggled his finger, insisting she do what he asked. And it wasn't the size of his massive muscles that peeked out of his animal skin vest. Okay, maybe it was the brogue. But in any case, she did as she was told and stepped to the back of the box, hoping he would relax a little if he thought she wouldn't resist. She could totally believe he was dangerous, but she had a hard time believing he was a danger to her. Yes, he'd used her as a shield to get through the crisis unit, but in the hallway, she'd sensed he was protecting her, that his little twirl had been meant to draw fire away from her, where she cowered against the elevator doors. Of course, she would be a fool to trust her senses, especially when his size and form were clearly affecting her. She had to be smart or she was dead. Simple as that. She had to get some blood back to her brain. Think clearly. Think of him as a patient, a dangerous patient. Stay objective.
Mental notebook. Patient 1. Name.
She'd have to leave that blank for the moment.
Age. Late 20s or early 30s, maybe. Hard to tell. Lots of scars, but smooth skin. Hard life is obvious. Must reserve pity. Pity could be dangerous here. Nationality? Scotland, probably. Languages? Gaelic and English for sure.
If she had a pen and paper, she would underline that one about 10 times and add a handful of large, angry exclamation points.
Eye color, hazel. He's careful not to make eye contact. Guilt?
Worried she will learn his vulnerability. He obviously doesn't trust her any more than he trusted those guards.
Danger to himself? Not likely. Reckless? Yes. Danger to others? Oh boy.
The most important thing now was to keep him from losing his temper or from triggering whatever incited his violence. She wasn't about to ask what had happened earlier. Her number one job was to keep herself safe so she could live to see another day, live to help a different patient. Helping this one probably wasn't going to happen now, and if he was caught again by morning and survived, Rentmeister would be around to handle the particulars.
Number one job. Number one job.
I'll not harm ye, lass. I swear it on my good name. She forced a little smile, but she couldn't meet his gaze for more than a second, or she worried he might see just how terrified she was. Being locked in a tiny room with Thor, a Thor that had already proven he had no respect for human life. Well, it would have been tough for anyone. Oh, sure, he looked like the stuff of romance novels and superhero movies with incredible casting. But there was a huge difference between romance in the air and blood in the water. The guy was a beast, sexy as hell, but still a beast.
Number one job.
His brows slammed together and he leaned close, forcing her to look at him. She had to bite her lip to keep it from trembling, but she gave him her attention. I willna harm ye.
I guess we'll see.
She hadn't intended to say something so stupid, but it was too late now. He was already offended. The first time her life was truly in danger, and she'd let her mouth do her thinking. He hovered in her face, his brows still slammed together, like he thought she would take it back if he scowled at her long enough. But her pride wouldn't let her do it. And to her relief, he snorted and straightened away. 6'4", maybe 5. There wasn't much room between the ceiling panels and his head. The elevator dinged. 6th floor. Why had they gone up? He grabbed her wrist and kind of stutter-stepped to the edge, then jumped out like a kid reaching the bottom of the escalator for the first time. So of course she was yanked out too. He pulled her closer and wrapped his arm around her while he rubbed the offended wrist. "Forgive me," he said. But then he grabbed her upper arm and started dragging her along again. His hand was so large his fingers touched his thumb, and it made her reconsider her workout program. or rather her lack of a workout program. He paused in front of the fire escape map on the wall, then took her to the stairs. She let out a breath when he started down the steps instead of up to the roof. Lots of violent sprees ended in suicide or cop-assisted suicide, and the second she'd seen they'd gone to the top floor, she worried he might have planned something dramatic, like splattering himself on the pavement. She would have quickly changed her danger to self-assessment had he not started down the steps. He'd promised not to harm her. She repeated it in her head a couple of times each floor. He'd been offended when she hadn't believed him, so she chose to believe him. It had nothing to do with that brogue, possibly. Either way, she was relieved for him too that he hadn't intended to go out in a blaze of glory in front of TV cameras. But then again, a few dozen cops were surely waiting for them as soon as they set foot on the first floor. With a cop killer on the loose, they'd probably be itching for a shootout. Would they negotiate for her sake? Justice had never said if he was a good shot or a poor one. Would he be able to hit the Scotsman and miss her? But wait, she didn't want her patient shot either. They had just passed the door to the second floor when she dug her feet in to stop him.
Hang on.
There was that frown again, but she pressed on.
They'll be waiting for you down there, but on the second floor.
She hoped she remembered right.
There is a fire escape at the back of the building.
He nodded and returned to the door. She looked through the window first, but saw no one. Then, together, they hurried inside. He released her arm, and when she looked back to find out why, he gestured for her to go on ahead. "I'll be right on your heels, lass. Lead on, and quickly." She was free. She could do anything at all to thwart him, but she didn't want to see anyone shot to pieces, all because she'd opened that observation room door. And she was sure she'd feel the same about any patient who might or might not be guilty of murdering someone, even if they weren't wearing a kilt and flexing every muscle when they moved, like a sleek mountain lion. Surely. She slowed down when she heard voices ahead. They were on the surgical floor, which was pretty much shut down for the night except for emergencies. But the lights were low. No people rushing around, no alarms going off. Larkin pressed herself against the wall and peeked around the corner. A couple of interns were making out against the wall about 20 feet away. She knew no other route to the exit she remembered, and getting lost in these circling halls might cost them everything. She looked back at her captor and shook her head.
2 people,
she whispered.
They're not going anywhere.
He frowned and motioned her away, slouched against the wall and took a peek. After he did, he turned back with a grin on his face. "Not long now, I reckon." She didn't understand and moved close for another look. The couple had stopped talking altogether, and their kissing had turned frantic and passionate. She was embarrassed to be watching and stepped back from the corner to find herself holding on to the sash draped across the chest of the Scottish god. He glanced at her lips. His grin slipped away. And when he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to hers, she was strangely relieved, like a tension between them had fallen away. When she opened her eyes, however, she noticed a small black camera above the Scotsman's head. Luckily, it was turned toward the intersection they hadn't yet entered. She glanced around. No other cameras. She tapped the man on the chest, a thrill unto itself, and pointed up. He seemed to understand the problem, moved a gurney beneath the camera, and slowly rotated it away from their path. She watched the couple as they slid along the wall and pushed their way through a doorway.
They're gone,
she whispered. Pity, he said. We might have been forced to remain here for hours. He glanced at her lips again, licked his own, then gave her a wink that made Justice's winks seem like frosty kisses in comparison. There was a playfulness in his eyes that Justice lacked, and a heat that made her think about the couple down the hall. Extract your mind from the gutter, lass. We've an escape to manage still. She chuckled lightly, then headed down the corridor, desperately hoping that things would look familiar. After all, she'd only been there once before, and another worry she kept to herself, that the fire escape she remembered might actually have been in another hospital. Chapter 6. It was a year ago, give or take a month, when Larkin accompanied Rent to Landry Medical Centre on a call. They'd driven up from St. Paul to see a cocaine addict who had relapsed and tried to kill himself in the middle of a binge. As was often the case, he'd gotten his hands on a large quantity of powder and developed a state of complete psychosis where he couldn't connect with reality. He believed Larkin was there to harm him, so she'd had to withdraw from the room. It was while she waited for Rent that she was asked to consult with a woman whose 11-year-old son was in surgery. She'd been working herself up for a couple of hours, so a nurse asked Larkin to go to the surgical waiting room and see what she could do. That story had ended much better than the one Rent had been dealing with, though Larkin hadn't made much of a difference. But, looking back, she wondered if fate had sent her to the woman just so she would know where the fire escape was. She remembered turning left. A sign on the wall pointed the rest of the way, and with every step she became more confident that the fire escape was there. She remembered staring at that emergency exit for over an hour, while the little boy's mother had shared her soul, confessing every little mistake she'd made in raising her child. Little, stupid details that haunted the woman, like forgetting to put money under the kid's pillow one night because she'd fallen asleep, and, just like that, her son had stopped believing in the tooth fairy, as if belief in fairy tales was the most important part of his childhood. Fairy tales, Larkin believed, should be reserved for fairies. The sooner kids realized there was no magic in the world, the sooner they'd be able to deal with reality, and fewer little girls would waste their time waiting for fairy godmothers and heroic princes to fix their little worlds. They could fix their worlds themselves, like she'd done. And one day, she was going to make a difference in someone else's world too. One day, one patient. Then she'd know that all her sacrifices weren't in vain. She stopped in front of the door she'd been looking for and glanced back at the Scotsman. Too bad she couldn't have made a difference for him. The best she could do now was to give him a fighting chance, to keep him from walking into a hailstorm of bullets. But that was all she could do. Her one day, one patient plan would have to wait for another day and another patient.
Here, this is it.
She pushed the door open and led him inside, shut the door behind them, and moved to a door in the far wall where the exit sign glowed green.
Here's your way out.
He read the warning written along the bar. But the alarm will sound, will it not?
Not if you climb out through the window.
The second floor wasn't far enough off the ground that someone could jump to their death, so the windows opened wide enough for a body to fit through. You'll go first, lass. Normally, I would make certain the way is safe, but if I did, you'd not follow, and I have need of ye for a wee while longer.
And what if I refused?
He shook his head slowly. I'd not advise it. The bastard seemed to have no qualms about shooting in your direction if it might bring me down. If ye make a hue and a cry, ye put yourself in danger, aye. He was suddenly standing within inches of her, leaning over her like a large, hungry bird. But dinna flash over your options, lass. You have only the two. Either ye come along on your feet, or ye come along over my back. He tilted his head to one side, and then the other, sizing her up. And I warrant ye'll be no burden. She might have scoffed at that, had she not been so terrified by the possibility of being slung over his back like a Santa sack. She might not be tall, but she was far from light. Was he blind? Her black pants bulged just enough to prove they weren't a recent purchase. The jacket looked more hand-me-down than her usual hand-me-downs, and it was tight enough in the pits to make her arms bow out a little instead of hanging down at her sides. Under his close scrutiny, she felt ridiculous in her retro chic. Heck, she didn't even know what retro chic was. Old and cool, she supposed. Or maybe not old enough to be cool, like stuff a mum wears when she stops shopping for her own clothes because she spends too much time shopping for her kids. And the only thing worse than retro chic that wasn't retro enough to be chic was having it all a half size too small. After ye, he murmured, then took a step back and pointed to the window. And just in case, he slipped his long leather strap through the back of her belt, slid the buckle to the end, and gave it a tug to make sure it would hold. And remember, time is against us both. I'd hate to see ye shot with that taser. That was all she needed to hear to get moving. If anyone was watching the footage from the second-floor cameras, they would soon realize that something wasn't right, and the possibility of Justice coming down the hall with a newly charged taser gun made her sick to her stomach. It was only slightly worse than the twist in her gut when she'd found out that a sheriff was waiting for her. Larkin cleared the window and found her footing on a wide ledge outside. In the expanse of visible hospital grounds, she saw no officers, no flashing lights. Apparently, there weren't enough of them to surround the entire building and search for them too, but it was only a matter of time. She held tight to the leather strap to ensure the guy didn't pull her off balance as he climbed out the window, but he didn't so much as take up the slack, and it took him about 3 seconds to get through the opening. The ladder from the 3rd floor was only a foot to the left of him. A stretch of grass ran straight out from the building between 2 parking lots, with a smattering of cars, and ended at the base of a hill. Beyond that was a mountain covered in shrubbery, fit to hide a Scotsman, a place where he could hide for years if he liked, a place where no one could find him, no one could lock him up. No one could prevent him from killing again. Did she really want him to escape? If he killed again, the blood would be on her hands.
I'm sorry,
she said.
You're on your own now.
And as soon as he was down the ladder, and there was a good 20 yards between them, she'd start screaming. He rolled the ladder extension until it hit the ground, then faced her with an outstretched hand. Come with me, lass. He acted like he hadn't heard a word. She shook her head.
No.
The ledge wasn't wide enough to handle a struggle. She could only pray he would let her stand her ground. "Aye, dinna kill that man," he said, his hand still waiting for her to take it.
I never asked.
Your sheriff killed him.
What? No.
Even if the man was just trying to trick her into trusting him, the idea of justice being corrupt filled her stomach with liquid revulsion, like a hose had been turned on full force.
How dare you?
He sighed. Whether or nay ye believe me, I canna leave you here in such danger. Who kens how many lives he and his men will destroy to conceal their sins? She shook her head. She couldn't trust this guy. He would do or say anything to get away. Justice had warned her he would. However, she couldn't help feeling a little disappointed. He'd had plenty of opportunity to hurt the guards and hadn't. He'd even tossed their guns away instead of using them, so her impression of him had been at odds with the violent man he supposedly was. But maybe justice was right about him after all. He eased closer, watching her face, his arm extended as if to catch her if she thought to jump. But she dared do nothing more drastic than shake her head again. If she so much as straightened her arm to keep him away, he might fall more than 15 feet. For your own good, he murmured, as he suddenly bent over, knocked the wind out of her with his shoulder, and threw her over his back. She squealed, but the sound died a lonely death in the eerie silence. They fell together, then suddenly swung sideways around the ladder.
Not gonna die. I'm not gonna die.
The ground rose jerkily up to meet her, and she fought to calm her racing heart while the guy climbed to the ground. It was difficult, though, to take deep breaths with a meaty shoulder pressing into her stomach. A few feet before she might have struck pavement, he stepped off the ladder and started running. She watched the hospital grow further and further from reach, while she used every muscle to keep from bouncing too hard. With one hand tucked around the back of her left thigh, he held her legs tight against him. It was the only sign he remembered she was there at all. He sprinted across the stretch of grass. At the far edge, when they reached the shelter of some bushes, he lowered her to the ground. Then he took her hand and started pulling her up the rise. But this was it, now or never. She had her feet under her again, and if she was going to resist, she needed to do it before he got her up into the mountains, because she sure as hell wasn't going to run off into the woods in a pair of hospital socks. She dropped to her knees. The pull of his hand tipped her forward, but he stopped and waited for her to get to her feet again. She shook her head.
This is where you'll leave me. There's no one on our tails, so you don't need me for a hostage.
On your feet, lass.
No!
She tried to pull her hand away from him, but he held tight. He glanced back at the hospital alert. She looked too. A meagre flash of red lights lit up the night to one side of the wide building, but the car itself never came into view. One car? Either there had been some other emergency nearby, or justice hadn't called for much backup. The whole place should have been lit up by now, shouldn't it? At the intersection of two main roads, state patrol cops should have joined the hunt by now. Or had all the drama made time move more slowly for her? He pulled on her hand again. Come, lass, one way or another. She really didn't want to have his shoulder pounding into her middle while he hefted her up the hill, but he needed to know she was determined. If he thought she was a big enough pain in the butt, maybe he would leave her behind.
You're wasting precious time,
she said, and moved on to her butt, making it harder for him to pick her up. Through the shadows of the long hair hanging in his face, she watched a slow smile form on those lips that had been pressed against hers maybe 10 minutes before. A chill originated at the back of her skull and shot out across her skin, down her spine and over her limbs. Simultaneously, warmth spread through her veins. Bad signs all around. Chapter 7. The Scotsman leaned toward her, pulling on her hand as he reached behind her head. She couldn't think of him as the prisoner any more. The prisoner was now Larkin Nash, dishonoured psychologist and soon-to-be former provider at R&L Centre for Mental Health. He took hold of her ponytail and pulled her closer. "Beware of offering your enemy such a handle, lass, and never dare a Highlander." He pressed his mouth to hers again, but this time there was some serious pressure there, like he was trying to communicate the fact that he was completely in charge of their situation. It was a point made even more clear by the fact that she was now on her feet, though she hadn't noticed standing. But Larkin had had enough bullying for one day, and in spite of the fact that she might be experiencing the best, most passionate, heart-stopping kiss of her life, she bit him. He pulled back and licked his lips, then chuckled quietly.
"Beware of offering your enemy your tongue,"
she said, then shook her head, trying to get him to release her hair, and was surprised when he did. But his attention was back on the hospital. There were 2 deputies visible, one from each end of the building, converging toward the centre of the building, where they would find the fire escape ladder still on the ground. They would know she and the patient had probably headed up the hill. It was only a matter of time. Yes, it was dark, but she and the Highlander weren't farther than a football field from the ladder. Once the deputies looked their way, they were toast. "Forgive me," said her captor. He pulled her back against his chest and slapped his massive hand over her mouth. Once again she felt herself falling as he pulled her back and off balance, but she landed softly between his knees in the weeds. She held on to his forearm for balance, not intending to struggle. Drawing attention probably meant drawing fire. He shifted behind her again and again, while she watched the deputies move closer to the ladder. Any second now. Was he planning to use her as a shield? If that big hand wasn't held so firmly against her face, she might have asked. Why didn't he run, take off without her? If she had allowed him to descend to the first floor, he could have been shot and killed. Yes, her idea had saved him, but for how long, if he kept doing silly things like sitting down and waiting for the officers to find him? The stars suddenly disappeared from view as a large swathe of plaid shot out over her head and settled around her. The smell of wool and masculine sweat filled the pockets of air near her face.
"Are you kidding me? His plan is to hide under the blanket?"
Well, not all of a blanket. She would have known if he'd slipped out of the entire kilt, wouldn't she? His head pressed against the side of hers. "Hush now, lass. If ye think to struggle, I'll have no choice but to lay atop ye, do ye ken, and I'd hate to have to crush the breath out of ye." She couldn't have nodded if she'd tried. He held her that tight. But she wouldn't have moved anyway. She was scared stiff, and it didn't have anything to do with a gorgeous man threatening to squish her. It was pure fear that kept her from taking a normal breath. Those cops were going to see a mass of Scottish plaid lying on the hillside, making a nice big target, and they were going to shoot. Why wouldn't they?
"There's a dangerous Scotsman. He can't be contained. He's out of his mind, and he's already killed a sheriff."
Oh yeah, they were going to shoot. She closed her eyes and prayed, trying to remember anything in her past that might warrant serious repentance. She was glad she'd had a chance to wear the shoes. If she hadn't, they'd be gobbled up by her landlady when she came to clean out Larkin's apartment. And if there was one person she didn't want getting a hold of her stuff, even if it was her case of top ramen, it was that rude, loud woman. Oh well, nothing could stop her. Let her have the top ramen. Everything else was on its last leg, including her car, because she'd been waiting for that first real paycheck to come in, and that might rot away in an envelope in some police evidence room. Rent would come to her funeral, no matter how stupid he might think she was for opening that door and letting a dangerous man get free. He'd still come pay his respects. They'd made a promise to each other one day, over lunch, that whoever survived the other would make sure there were flowers and at least one mourner. With her earthly belongings settled and her funeral insured, she had nothing really to worry about now except the pain.
Not the head. Please, don't shoot me in the head.
Lass. She shook her head ever so slightly, a movement that could have only been felt and not seen. Lass, you must take a breath. I'll not let them harm ye. I swear on my good name. The warm press of his face against hers made her pant even faster. She was hyperventilating. Forgive me, he said again, and pinched her nose shut. She lost it and thrashed her head, trying to move his immovable arms. She thought her chest would explode with the pressure of trying to exhale. Her ears popped as he rolled her onto her stomach and threw a heavy leg over hers. With his free arm, he held her shoulder against the ground. She was mad, but she could breathe again, and the hand was gone from her mouth. Wheesht now, lass. Easy then. Try to hold your breath again. Count to 10. You're hyperventilating. Hyperventilating. Right. When you don't have a paper bag handy, the quickest cure was to hold your breath for as long as you could. He was right. She did what he said, held her breath for 10 seconds, waited, then held it again. But if she lived long enough, she was going to make him pay for scaring the hell out of her. Hush now, they're coming this way. She froze again. She was still beneath that tartan target and still in danger. Calmer, though. She no longer had too much oxygen in her system. She heard the muffled squawk of a radio. It couldn't have been 20 feet away, and though she strained to hear footsteps, she was temporarily distracted by the stroke of a thumb along her shoulder, where her captor held her down. What did he think she was? A cat? A nervous horse? What? No trace of them, a man said. They could be halfway up the mountain by now. We're going to need help. Damn it, came a familiar voice on the radio. I wanted to get this handled quietly. No chance, boss. It's already hit the internet. My wife called. The Cass County boys will be here any minute, I'm sure. All right then. If we have to have their help, then we'll take advantage. Let them scour the hills, and while they do, we'll get our people equipped with tasers and knives. Knives? Bullets don't bring him down, Conrad. He's got some kind of armor. We might end up cutting off his head to stop him. Two men chuckled, apparently standing together now. One had to be Jack Conrad, a deputy she'd met a couple of times. Poetic justice for Reiser. Something like that. Sorry about Larkin, boss. I'm sure we'll get her back. There was a pronounced silence while Larkin waited for a tender word. All units get off this frequency until further notice, Justice finally said. We don't need some ham listening in and sharing information on Facebook. Well, he's got a woman with him, so it's not like he can go all Rambo on us, Conrad said. Damn it, I said get off this frequency. The radio cut off. Payette can't be serious, eh? He won't make us cut off the guy's head, will he?" "I know there were shots fired," Conrad said, "and I know the guy is still walking, so maybe. Or maybe he's just freaking out because the bastard took Larkin." There was a short pause while she strained to hear. "I don't know." Conrad's voice again. "If it was my girlfriend out there, might have called the state police and the FBI by now. Or maybe you'd want to kill the guy yourself. Did you think of that?" Conrad chuckled. "Yeah, maybe it's not really his head the sheriff wants to cut off." They were so close. Though Larkin tried to control herself, she couldn't stop the tremors from rolling through her body, which just made her panic worse. If the two officers were so blind they couldn't see the plaid blanket, they couldn't miss it if it started shaking. When the men spoke again, however, they were too far away to tell what they were saying, and they certainly weren't standing over her, waiting for her to show herself. A couple of minutes crawled by. When the Scotsman finally removed his leg and released her shoulder, she could hardly move. All that adrenaline pumping through her body had acted like hot wax that had cooled and hardened, making her joints stiff. But eventually she was able to roll over and take a peek outside their little cocoon. She started praying a different kind of prayer, all thank yous, and she tried to ignore the little pain beneath her collarbone, the throbbing that had begun when Justice hadn't said anything about her. She had to remember that he wasn't terribly emotional, so maybe he wanted to keep his feelings to himself and not broadcast them. But what hurt her the most was that he hadn't asked for help in finding her. She sucked in a deep breath and forced it out again. Moping wasn't a luxury she could afford at the moment, so she decided to give Justice the benefit of the doubt until she heard his side of the story. She just had to trust that he had good reasons for what he did and didn't do, reasons that would only occur to a seasoned sheriff. The wool was lifted away from her, and cool, fresh air hit her in the face. From the corner of her eye, she saw the guy kneeling on the ground, laying out the plaid, taking the time to make a few pleats. Looking closer, the pattern blended in with the hillside so well, she finally understood why the deputies had missed them.
It was camouflage.
The sleeveless shirt beneath his vest was surprisingly long, but it didn't quite cover his butt, and she felt her face heating like a hot plate. She couldn't tell if his thighs were really hairy, or if it was just shadows, but she turned away before she could be caught investigating. He wasn't paying attention. If she jumped up and ran, she could put a little distance between them. She might get all the way to the first car before he caught up with her, if he bothered to chase her down. He'd be better off leaving her behind. Maybe he had realized that while they'd been waiting to be discovered. "We need to get moving before the next search party arrives," the Scotsman said, his voice heavy and sober. He came to stand in front of her, fully covered again except for those powerful legs. She moved right to the apology.
I'm sorry I delayed you. If you want to leave me behind now, I promise I can take care of myself.
"Nay, lass, I only regret I could not leave ye in your ignorance. But now that you know what the man is capable of, you're also the enemy, aye."
He doesn't know you speak English. He won't know you told me.
"No time to debate, lass. The danger has passed, but will return any moment." He was right. She got to her feet while he watched the east end of the building where the deputies had disappeared. She should have run while she had the chance. Why hadn't she run? Her little green cricket of a conscience piped up.
Because no one wants to be alone when they're hurting. Even if they're with a guy who might lose his head, literally.
Chapter 8. The night sky rotated above them, and a new set of constellations lit the night. Larkin pulled up her hospital socks and started up the hillside. She hadn't taken more than 3 or 4 steps when the Scotsman stopped her with a whisper. "Where do you go, lass?" She paused and pointed at the top of the rise. "Nay, did you not hear? That's where they'll be looking." He waved his fingers. "Come, and hurry." He picked his way west through the low shrubs, angling away from the hospital, all the while holding out his hand for her, expecting her to catch up and take it. There was something so unreal about that wide, strong hand floating out there like a carrot, luring her away from what she knew, from the man she had always trusted, from safety. There was absolutely no reason for her to take that hand, to attach herself to a stranger who had probably killed Robert Reiser. But she found herself clipping along, catching up, and as she reached out for him, she heard Melody Cotterill's voice in her head.
"Say it really. Wait till you see him."
For a second, she pulled her hand back, asking herself if the only reason she was going along with this man was because he did look like an ancient Scottish god. Looking down the length of his long arm, she saw mound after mound of muscle. If the rest of him looked the same, it was no wonder he was able to toss a 200-pound woman over his shoulder and run. He could probably force anyone to do his will, but would he kill? He glanced at her, looked at his still empty, still extended hand, then at her face. "Decide," his expression said. She faced ahead. They were nearly to a thick swath of trees that would hide them for the next half-mile, leaving behind the hospital and the forest beyond the hill. If she stopped and ran back, she thought maybe he would let her go this time. He would think she was a fool and probably running to her own doom, but he would let her go. Or he would take her with him, protect her. Nearly there, no more debate. She admitted that she had already made up her mind. Maybe it was the brogue. Maybe it was that second kiss. Hell, maybe it was the first one, but it didn't matter. She stretched toward him a mere inch or two before his hand swallowed hers, his fingers wrapped around her wrist. Maybe he'd known, too, that she would choose him. He swung her toward him and paused long enough to scoop her up into his arms before plunging them both into the dark, vertical shadows that waited for them. "Next time you have need to run for your life thus, remember to wear shoes." She laughed.
"Next time?"
He grinned, his mouth enticingly close. "Aye, next time." Compelled to touch him, she lifted her hand, but she hesitated, not knowing how to go about it. After a couple of seconds, she laid it back on his shoulder. He pretended he hadn't noticed, but a few seconds later his gaze dropped to her arm for a split second, like he was waiting for it to lift again. Maybe he wanted that contact as much as she did, or maybe her 24-year-old brain no longer functioned well on a couple hours' sleep, and it had forgotten the fact that she was running away with the man who had killed Robert Reiser, and the last thing she should be focused on was his lips. The Northland Arboretum was a 500-acre recreational property that included the Paul Bunyan Conservation Area with a spaghetti bowl of nature trails. Its main purpose was to encourage present and future generations to become nature enthusiasts. In the winter, those trails were groomed for cross-country skiing, and others were left rough for for snowshoes and winter hiking. A popular venue for wedding receptions, both indoors and out, the Arboretum had a large gazebo tucked into the trees, a setting destined to be popular with brides and photographers. In the early hours before dawn, Larkin and the Highlander emerged from one of those nature trails, one that had been groomed well enough for a chick in stocking feet. They found the white gazebo glowing like a beacon against the eerie shadows, beckoning them to sit and rest. Automatic sprinklers had done their job and left a layer of dew-like moisture on everything in sight, making every blossom in the garden smell as if it had bloomed in the past few minutes.
Maybe I'm dreaming all this,
Larkin whispered. Would you care for a pinch, so that you may know for certain? The Scotsman gave her a wink, tugged on her hand, then led her up the path beneath a trellis and into the gazebo. Though she'd been carried part of the way, Larkin was exhausted. After such a rush of adrenaline in her system, she was crashing after the high. On top of that, she'd closed her eyes around midnight, awakened at 3:20, and those 3 hours' sleep hadn't prepared her for the day ahead. The sun and reality were gearing up to punch her in the face. She could just feel it. She collapsed on a small bench, and though there were 4 others to choose from, the man sat down next to her. We shall rest for a wee bit, but we must put as much distance as possible between us and your brother, and as quickly as we can. Brother? Of course she didn't have a brother. She was clear-headed enough to remember that.
Excuse me?
So he could see her better, he moved a long lock of hair away from his face, flipped it over his shoulder, then he repeated himself. She shook her head.
Oh, I understood you. But just who do you think is my brother?
His brows quirked together. Why, the sheriff. She gasped, insulted. Even the little green cricket in her head was speechless. Aye, what else could he be to you then? I saw him kiss your forehead when he greeted ye. I doubt he would do the same with a co-worker, aye. His brows lifted. I suppose he might have been a cousin, then, but a kinsman surely. He clearly didn't understand that Justice couldn't just kiss her on the lips at the hospital, where they were technically co-workers, but she wasn't going to discuss it with the man. The air shifted through the damp trees that surrounded them. She folded her arms to ward away a sudden chill and changed the subject.
What is your name?
Forgive me. He stood up and gave her a strangely old-fashioned bow. Brodrick Matthew Shaw at your service. He sat again. And you're Larkin Nash, a doctor.
And you're a Scotsman, aren't you?
Nay, lass, I'm a Highlander.
From Scotland, though, right?
Naturally, but a Highlander make nae mistake.
Okay, so you're a Highlander. Would you mind telling me what brings you to Minnesota? What you're doing here?
He shrugged. What brought me here is a wee witch, and what I'm doing here is simple enough. I'm failing.
Failing?
He released a burst of laughter that made her jump. I tell you, a witch brought me, and what catches your attention is my failure. Since there was no telling how early the groundskeepers might show up to do their work in cooler temperatures, she lowered her voice.
I thought it might be better to deal with the simple stuff first.
That was an understatement.
What did you fail at?
Shaw sobered and glanced away. She waited, silently, sensing he wouldn't react well if she pushed him. Violence wasn't a worry, but getting him to open up might help her find a way to help him, and hopefully help herself. I believe. He took a deep breath that again lifted his chest and that plaid sash. I believe I was sent to save the man who died. Obviously, if that was my task, I failed well and good.
and all because I dragged my boots about common in the first place. Had I accepted my challenge immediately, I might have arrived before the man was shot, and not after it was too late."
Larkin had been eyeing the bench on the opposite side of the gazebo, hoping she might be able to stretch out and close her eyes while they talked, but that wasn't possible anymore. She was wide awake now. He sounded perfectly lucid, except that part about a witch, and what's more, he sounded like he was telling the truth, that he wasn't responsible for Reiser's death. Unfortunately, she knew what he'd say next, that the guilty party was Justice Payette, and though she dreaded hearing it again, she hoped there might be a hole or two in the story that would allow her to believe that her boyfriend, if he still was her boyfriend, was the upstanding officer he claimed to be.
I think you'd better start a little earlier in the story,
she said.
"But you dinna wish to hear about the witch?"
She sighed.
I'll try to keep an open mind, okay?
"Oh, you'll be needing more than just an open mind, lass. You'll need a bit of faith as well."
She nodded.
I'll do my best.
He bit his lip while he leaned close and tried to look into her eyes. The shadows were fading into a greyish-green as dawn warned it was on its way. She tried to mask any signs of doubt, but his smirk said she'd failed. He nodded forcefully.
"You're a sweet lass, but you canna lie to save your life."
He reached over and took her hand, laid it on his knee, then pinned it there with his own, like he expected her to run.
"Take what rest you feel you need, but the sun will soon rise, and we must find a hiding spot. I'm bound to stand out like a nudist on Sunday."
So you're not going to tell me about the witch?
All expression fell away from his face.
"What witch?"
She had heard some pretty disturbing delusions in her line of work, so she was sure she could handle his, but he didn't trust her yet, and that little fact caused a slight ache in her chest she had to ignore, or the man might read it on her face. No, she couldn't force him to trust her with his story, but she could at least earn his respect, and respect might lead to trust if they had a little more time together. So she got to her feet in spite of him still pinning her hand to his knee.
I'm ready when you are.
His brows lifted, then the corners of his mouth followed suit. He jumped to his feet and stepped to the gazebo's opening.
"This is your country, lass. Tell me what lies beyond this park."
She looked him over in the pale light and realized that if he were that striking in the pre-dawn, then they were really going to be in trouble once the sun was up.
We need to get you out of that kilt.
He smirked.
"Ye Americans, you canna make up your minds. You want a man in his kilt, but as soon as you have one, you want him to take it off again."
He laughed at his own joke. She bit down on her lip to keep from joining in.
"I ken what you mean, though. Why Sonny saw fit to send me to the States was a shock, to say the least. She kens how you loathe—"
He twisted his lips around like he regretted sharing so much information, even though Larkin didn't know what he was talking about.
"Never mind," he said. "Let us find a clothesline with something more fitting in my size."
A clothesline?
He shrugged.
"It's a line upon which you hang your clothes to dry after washing. I ken not what Americans call such a thing, but perhaps you've never deigned to wash your own clothes."
Of course I wash my own clothes, but you won't find many clotheslines around anymore. And besides, I'm not a thief. We'll have to go shopping. There is a Walmart near Perch Lake, not far from here. If we hurry, we can get you changed before it's light.
"And I suppose you keep enough coin on your person to purchase anything you wish."
I've got plenty.
She pulled $5,700 bills out of her pocket, waved them a couple of times, then stuffed them back where they came from.
I cashed my first paycheck and bought a pair of shoes, but I didn't have time to open a new account. And I don't trust my landlady, so I couldn't leave it at home. Lucky thing, though, right? They might be able to trace credit cards, but not this.
She stopped talking when she noticed the pained, almost angry expression on his face. She'd been stupid to wave cash around in front of him. Maybe he was reconsidering his options. Lucky, aye, you're well and truly blessed, but I'll tell you true, I'll have not the time nor the means with which to repay ye if you spend your earnings on new clothing for me. She released a breath of relief. He was embarrassed. That had to be the problem.
Don't worry, I don't need you to pay me back.
He, on the other hand, didn't seem relieved at all. In fact, his frown seemed even fiercer than before. I will be in your debt in any case. She pulled her hand from his grasp and started down the trail.
Look on the bright side,
She said sarcastically.
Maybe we'll get caught before we make it to the store and you won't owe me anything at all.
Chapter 9. Larkin stomped along the Paul Bunyan trail, and though she was grateful for a number of things, a lack of early morning runners, the fact that the trail ran beneath the freeway, or the smoothness of the track that allowed her to walk instead of being carried, she still had a hard time shaking off her sour mood. The high and mighty Highlander didn't want to owe her any favours. Well, it was too late for that. He already owed her big time. Thanks to him, her professional career might never recover, at least in Minnesota. The paperwork hadn't been completed yet for her partnership with Rent and the others, and even if Rent defended her, his associates would be all too happy to cut ties with a psychologist that might be prone to lawsuits for letting dangerous patients loose on the citizens of Minnesota. All her carefully laid plans for the future could be over in the blink of an eye. She'd have to start over, and she'd have to do it far away. Maybe Rent would take pity on her and write a few letters of recommendation, as long as she went far enough. She growled and kicked a rock, forgetting she had no shoes on. Pain rang in her foot like a gong. She grabbed her toe to try and stop it and had to hop around to keep from tipping over. A big hand reached out to grab her, but she yanked her elbow away and lost her balance, smacking her knee on the hard trail because she was still holding her toe. Loss. He bent over her.
Leave me alone.
She crawled gracelessly to her feet and stood quickly, bumping his chin with her head. When he gasped, she regretted it immediately, but her pride wouldn't let her show how much.
Sorry,
She grumbled, then started walking again. A pure liar, as I said before. His voice came from far behind, but she refused to look back. It's a natural thing to wish to hurt someone. His steps and voice grew closer. When they've caused you pain, so it is I who must apologise, lass. He strode along beside her then. No doubt you will pay a heavy price for my abduction, and then, of course, I've also broken your heart.
What?
She stopped and faced him.
I don't even know you. And just for the record, you're the one who kissed me both times.
He bit his lower lip, clearly trying to suppress his smile, but the dimples gave him away. He was laughing at her. She growled and stomped off again. He hurried to catch up. You misunderstand, Larkin.
Don't call me Larkin.
I only meant that your heart must be broken to find that your friend, the sheriff, is an evil man. She stopped again and spun on her stocking-covered heel.
He's not evil. I don't believe he killed Reiser. You're wrong about him, and you're wrong about us. He's my...
She growled again, frustrated that she couldn't come up with a term for their relationship that didn't sound like a junior high school romance. It didn't help that Jimmy was sitting on her shoulder doing the slow clap. Once more she turned and walked away. She was headed to Walmart, and the first thing she was going to buy was a pair of shoes. If she decided to buy him something besides a giant flannel nightgown, he'd be lucky. He'd be lucky if she didn't call the police. Her stomach dropped when they came around a corner and saw the large box store in the distance. She didn't want him caught, no matter how insulted she felt at the moment. The image of him being compressed into a squad car with his hands behind his back made her want to vomit. Something was very wrong in a universe where this reasonable Scottish god was the bad guy who needed to be locked away, and someone like her who had worked so hard for a position to help people wouldn't be given the chance to do so. She faced him. He was only a few feet away, but closing the space quickly. She wasn't ready to feel vulnerable again, so she put a hand on his chest to stop him. He looked at her hand, then her face. His expression was nothing she'd seen before. Maybe he was seeing her as something besides a hostage. Who knew? But what she needed at that moment was some respect.
Look, this might be the last place you can hide between here and the store. It's already too bright. Someone is bound to see you and turn you in. So you're going to have to hide in these trees and keep quiet. Do you understand? I'll hurry in and out. You'll just have to trust me to pick out something for you to wear. Something that will help you blend in.
And trust that you'll return.
Yeah, that too. But it's not very likely that I'll take off on my own, now is it? The police are probably looking for me too. If they nab me, they'll expect me to lead them to you. And I'm not quite mad enough to turn you in.
He pulled her against him, as if she were putting up no resistance at all. Then he kissed her hard and quick. Be careful, sweet Larkin. He brushed the hair away from her face while he studied her eyes. He shook his head as if in answer to some silent question. Then he kissed her yet again. It was a quick, too casual peck, really, and when it was over, he left her standing in the middle of the path with her mouth hanging open. The quick footsteps came from the direction of the freeway, and a runner came around the corner. He didn't miss a stride as he adjusted his angle to pass her, but she was sure he'd been just as surprised as she'd been. She watched him go to make sure he wasn't looking back, recognizing her from the news or something, but it didn't look like he had. Glancing back at the thick growth alongside the path, she could see no sign of Brodrick Shaw, but thanks to that camo plaid of his, he might be standing right in front of her and she wouldn't know it. Maybe he didn't need new clothes to blend in after all, but she needed shoes. And she needed a little break from the cloud of testosterone that surrounded him, like an aura, so she offered a grimace to the trees and turned to follow the runner toward the sanctuary that was Walmart. Shake a leg, lass. His voice gave no hint to where he hid. She rolled her eyes.
You need to keep quiet. Remember, anyone with a brogue in Minnesota will draw attention today.
And a single lass buying clothes for a man.
Won't raise an eyebrow, trust me. All I have to do is throw a box of tampons on the pile and no one will pay any attention.
I don't understand.
You weren't supposed to.
The Walmart parking lot held about 20 cars when she finally reached it. Inside the store, it looked like most of those cars belonged to employees, because there were only about 3 other people pushing carts around the store. She felt like 20 sets of eyes watched every move she made. At first glance, no one would know she was the same chick who might be plastered on the local news. Since she'd worn a ponytail at the hospital, she had removed the elastic and pulled her hair around her face before she'd come within range of the cameras in the parking lot. She'd also ditched her paisley blazer, but she couldn't do anything about the hospital socks until she got to the shoe department. There, she grabbed 2 pairs of tennis shoes in size 10, one pair to wear, the other for the clerk to scan. The last thing she needed was to be stopped for shoplifting a pair of shoes. Next, she bought food, unhealthy stuff that would give her a buttload of calories to make up for her lack of sleep. It was a trick she'd learned as an undergrad. The day the police started hunting you was not the day to worry about eating healthy, and she wanted to make sure her foreign visitor had a good taste of the America he seemed to be dissing. As she headed toward the men's clothing section, tears began flowing down her cheeks like someone had broken off a faucet. From now on, she realized, her life would be divided into before and after. But it wasn't the same mindshift she'd been prepared to make that week. She was going from before a good income to after a good income. She was leaving a predictable plan and stepping into a questionable future that would have to be relocated and scaled down.
My life will never be the same.
She'd thought those exact words when she'd bought the heels. Before money, after money, before heels, after heels, before and after the Brodrick Shaw episode. She'd come full circle, really. Shoes were back to being a necessity. At that moment, what she needed was a pair of shoes she could run in, could climb a hill in, could dodge bullets in if necessary. She found a 2XL black t-shirt with a boring decal on it, then went looking for the jeans. She had to guess his size by holding open the waistband. In the end, she settled for the largest waist and longest legs she could find on the shelves, a 40 by 40 square pants. She sighed. She was finally in a position to buy clothing for a man, and he wasn't even a boyfriend. Socks, tennis shoes for him, size 14 would have to do. Underwear. Crap, she'd nearly forgotten underwear. She got him boxer briefs because, well, just because. Since she was finally feeling a little normal, she decided to take a few more minutes to buy some stuff for her. If they were going to be on the run, she had to have clothes too. And hair dye. Didn't refugees from the law always dye their hair? Hers was a light brown. She wanted to try red, but decided that a darker brown would be change enough. She'd never thought she could afford a dye job before. When she saw how cheap they were, she wondered why she'd never tried it earlier. With bags piled high, she exited the store and pushed her cart around the corner opposite the one she'd come from. Then she abandoned the basket and took her sacks into the shadows beside a loading dock in the rear. She looked for cameras, ducked behind a large metal bin marked for cardboard recycling, and changed her clothes. A blue and white tie-dyed shirt with points that draped to her thighs was nothing like Larkin Nash would wear. Neither were the white leggings with eyelet lace around the ankles. Justice Payette could drive right past her and not recognize her, even without the white baseball cap with a bedazzled peace sign on the front. Of course, if someone were to scan the store footage, they'd know exactly what to look for. But hopefully by the time that happened, it would all be over. How it would end, however, she had no idea. She just hoped she could come up with a solid plan that would keep everyone calm and alive. She donned a fresh pair of socks and the tennis shoes. The rest of her stash she packed inside a large purse shaped like a duffel bag, then headed back toward the Paul Bunyan Trail. She was just entering the official path when she was jolted out of her skin by the high-pitched bleep of a cop's siren immediately behind her. She turned slowly with her one hand in plain sight and the elbow of her other arm lifted, since she was unable to release her terrified grip on the bag's long cotton handle. "Ma'am, step over to the car, please." Chapter 10. The cop expected her to walk. She was scared stiff, but she forced herself to breathe and step, breathe and step. He was seated inside the vehicle, his window down, his flashlight directed at her stomach, even though the sun was coming up. No gun. "Ma'am, you might want to reconsider taking the trail this morning. We've got a cop killer on the loose. A mental patient dressed in a Scottish kilt, if he hasn't changed out of it. We presume he's in the hills north of the hospital, but until he's caught you need to be careful." He suddenly opened his door and jumped out.
This is it. He recognizes me. Calm and alive. Stay calm and alive.
She was just about to get down on her knees when he patted her on the shoulder. "Oh, look what I've done. I've scared you, eh? I'm sorry, ma'am." He opened the back door and gestured for her to climb inside the car. "The least I can do is give you a ride home, or wherever you're headed, so you don't have to bother with the trail. I'm truly sorry I upset you, but what I said is true. The man and his accomplice are dangerous, and walking the Paul Bunyan at this hour is—"
You didn't say anything about an accomplice.
"Yeah, the woman that helped him escape the psych ward at the hospital, don't you know? They had something to do with the murder of the Cass County Sheriff yesterday,"
That's okay.
she said, backing away.
I'm not worried about the trail, eh?
She laid the accent on thick herself.
Plenty of joggers at this time of the morning. Besides, I've got to get my steps in, don't you know?
She smiled and gave him a little wave.
But don't worry, I'll keep an eye out.
He frowned at her. "You do that, eh?" She nodded and headed up the trail, giving him no more chances to look at her face and maybe remember it later. Larkin felt like Hansel and Gretel when they realized their breadcrumbs had been a bad idea, only she hadn't even thought to leave breadcrumbs to mark the spot where she'd left her Highlander.
Her Highlander?
She could just imagine how he'd laugh if he heard that. She stopped and looked back, trying to remember the point where he'd stepped into the landscape and disappeared. Couldn't he see her? Was he teasing? Was he asleep? Or maybe he didn't recognize her in her new clothes. Whatever the reason, he needed to snap out of it and give her a signal, because as soon as she was safely reunited with the Scottish god, who could watch her back for a little while, she was going to fall apart. Just as soon as she finished telling him how Justice Payette had completely and utterly betrayed her. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a wanted criminal.
Come on, Brodrick,
she whispered.
Where are you?
The trees ignored her. Not a leaf rustled. There was a fifth possibility, she realized. What if Brodrick had decided his chances were better without the baggage of her slowing him down? The prospect left her physically weak. Her lungs deflated along with her emotional state. It didn't matter that she might be better off alone, so she could turn herself in and try to clear her name. The truth was, she'd be more devastated by Brodrick Shaw abandoning her than she had been by Justice's betrayal, and that was pretty significant considering Justice had essentially put a target on her back and ensured she would have to go through hell itself just to stay out of jail if she survived at all. It was stupid, really, to feel so utterly alone when she'd been pretty alone since high school, up until about 3 hours ago. Maybe it was God who was teasing her.
Here's what it is like to have someone to lean on. Here's what you're missing. Oh, sorry. All you get is a taste. I should have never left him.
A couple of runners came around the corner. She stepped aside for them, then started dragging herself back up the trail. The gazebo was the destination she had in mind. At least she might be able to rest for a while, clear her head, make a plan. She hadn't gone more than 20 yards when a large, familiar figure stepped into view. his arms held out to his sides in a universal gesture that could only mean, "What the hell?" She was so overcome with relief that she ran to him and flung her arms around his middle, and before she had a chance to feel stupid about it, his arms settled on her back, and he held her tight. "In and out, you said."
Yeah, well, I thought of some things we needed.
"Forgive me." She stepped back automatically, trained now like Pavlov's dog to believe that whenever he said, "Forgive me," something bad was about to happen.
Forgive you for what?
For losing faith. I worried you wouldn't return, especially after I heard that strange noise. I thought perhaps the authorities had taken you away from me. She searched his face and could tell that he'd been just as upset as she'd been when she thought he'd left her. And she honestly couldn't remember an instance when Justice had been that emotional. In fact, whenever she had imagined him proposing to her, even her fantasized version of Justice Payette had been calm and cool. Well, she could stop wondering if that day would ever come.
An officer stopped me,
She said.
but he just warned me to be on the lookout for men in kilts.
She waved him back into the trees, then followed.
This path is about to get crowded.
She made sure they were well hidden before she dropped the bag off her shoulder and started digging through it. "What manner of clothing have you found for me?" She bounced her eyebrows a couple of times and grinned.
Square pants.
Chapter 11. Standing right next to a man while he was getting dressed was an odd type of torture, especially with her back turned to him. She heard every rustle, every strained breath, every grunt. Her imagination got away from her at one point, and she decided it would be better if she drowned out the noises with some quiet conversation.
By the way,
She said.
The cops believe I'm your accomplice now, that I came to the hospital to break you out, and that I was involved in Robert's murder too.
A hand wrapped around her arm and turned her. Brodrick appeared to be more alarmed by the news than anything else that had happened to him that morning, while she was a little distressed by the black t-shirt and how it squeezed his arms and chest. A nervous laugh escaped her, and to cover for it, she tried to think of something funny to say.
I think you could classify this as the all-time worst way to break up with a girl. I mean, if he'd texted me, it would have been kinder.
Brodrick pulled her against his body and wrapped his arms around her. The embrace was as sincere as the one she'd given him when he'd stepped out of the trees. And once again, she was struck by the fact that he didn't let his pride keep him from expressing himself. It was becoming her favourite trait in a man. "I should have kept my hands off of you, lass. Forgive me." Careful not to pull away, she said.
It's true. If you'd never used me as a shield, never taken me along, my life might have gone along the way I'd planned. I might have been forgiven for opening that door and inadvertently letting you escape. I might not. But you might have been killed, and I might have gone on to marry a corrupt sheriff. With no emotions at all.
She might have added.
So I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your hands exactly where they are.
"Will wonders never cease?" he said. She leaned back to look at his face.
Why do you say that?
He smiled into her eyes and stroked a thumb across her bottom lip. "You may have a drop or two of liar's blood in ye, after all." He lowered his head toward her, but she pulled back and he retreated. He let his hands fall away, then took a half-step back. "So, now that we have new camouflage, we should see about clearing your good name, aye?"
My good name? What about yours?
He shrugged a shoulder and picked up his pile of folded plaid, topped with yards of leather belts. Then he nodded his chin at her bag and held his stuff out while she made room for it. I will be content if I can but keep from spending the next day or so behind bars. I've had my fill of confinement. I want to feel the air in my lungs, the grass beneath my feet. I want to eat and swive and—
Swive? What's that?
Never you mind, lass. I misspoke is all.
A Scottish thing?
The corner of his mouth lifted in a smirk as he turned his head away, but he said nothing.
Well, I guess we'd better find you something to eat then. Maybe if you chopped off your hair, you wouldn't look so
His head swung back around, and the look he gave her was pure threat. It warned her not to insult his Highlandness again, so she bit her lip to keep the word Scottish from falling past her teeth and stepped away from him. It never fails to surprise me when an American with all the money in the world kens nothing of that world. Have you never thought to step foot outside your land of plenty, sail across the sea just to learn what lies on the other side? He stuck his head out of the trees and looked up and down the trail before gesturing for her to follow him out. She hurried onto the track, hoping no one would wonder what they'd been doing in the bushes. And they hit a comfortable stride before the next runner came around the bend. After she passed, Larkin picked up the conversation where they'd left off.
That was quite a rant, all because I'm not familiar with the difference between Highlanders and Scotsmen. And just because I don't know anything about Scottish politics doesn't mean I believe the world is flat.
He nodded sharply. What other languages do you speak?
I took Spanish in junior high,
she said defensively. Pero se pedre hablar con fluidez. She scowled.
What does that mean?
I asked if you could speak it fluently.
All I remember is how to say, "Kiss me, I speak Spanish."
He glanced at her lips again, then away. That's what they taught you in school. She shook her head and she looked down at the path, not wanting to see his reaction when she confessed she'd seen it on a t-shirt. He didn't laugh.
Look, most Americans can't afford to go to Disneyland, let alone Scotland. If they're visiting your hometown, they've either got money or they saved up a hell of a long time to be able to leave the country. What did your flight cost you? 1,000? 1,500?
He actually looked embarrassed. A lass sent me.
You mean someone paid your way?
Something like that. Larkin groaned inwardly. Of course he had a girlfriend. How could he look like he did and not have a dozen of them at any given time? She'd been right not to let him kiss her in the trees. Yes, his arms around her had helped bring her down off an emotional roller coaster, had helped her feel like she wasn't alone in all this. But it didn't mean they were a couple. In fact, she should have never allowed him to kiss her in the first place, and in the second, and third. They came along an opening that would put them on a real road.
Come on, we need to steal a car and get out of Minnesota if we can. The local police will be the most trigger-happy, and I might be able to think clearer if we can stop running. And kissing,
said Jiminy. The playboy hurried to keep up with her. Earlier, ye insisted you were no thief.
Yeah, well, that was before I was a murderer.
Chapter 12. They left Paul Bunyan Trail and walked along Cypress Drive. There were enough gawkers drilling after the playboy, of course, that she considered going back into the shelter of the trees and maybe hiding there for a month or two. If the news channels were showing any footage from the hospital cameras, however, passers-by would have a hard time believing that the wildly dressed Scottish god was the same guy stuffing Reese's peanut butter cups in his mouth and wearing jeans, a tight t-shirt and a ponytail made with the elastic that used to be in her hair.
So she soldiered on and settled for the role of the lucky chick holding his hand. It was all for the part she was playing, of course, just like he'd been playing all morning. She was sure of it. They turned onto Clearwater Road that led to the freeway and peeked into cars when they could, looking for forgotten keys and unlocked doors. It was hard to tell most of the time, but they couldn't look too closely with so many cars passing by. At the corner, they cut through the parking lot around the Days Inn, but there were cameras there, so they couldn't try any handles. She thought she could hotwire an ignition if they could just find an older car. Unfortunately, they saw none of those at the hotel.
We're just gonna have to hijack someone.
He gave her a warning look. If we do that, we canna let them loose again. You do realise?
Never mind. No hijacking. But maybe we can hitchhike.
She pointed to the Super America just down the block. At least half the stalls between gas pumps were full of people who might be convinced to give them a lift. A couple $100 bills might be tempting enough.
Come on.
She swung his hand and smiled like a loon while she tried to extract a bill from her pocket without pulling out every penny she now had to her name. As they neared the pumps, her nerves failed and she pulled Brodrick toward the building instead. They walked around to the far side and she knelt down to fiddle with her shoe while she tried to get her courage up. On that side of the station, there were only two outfits getting gas, a minivan full of kids and a pickup with a nice camping trailer hitched to the back. The man returning the nozzle to its resting place looked about 60. He screwed the cap on his tank and he and his wife headed for the building.
Perfect,
she whispered. She told the playboy to act casual and pulled him toward the minivan. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the glass door close behind the couple. She intended to tug Brodrick toward the RV, but he'd already figured out her plan. They strolled around the end of the trailer and up to the door like they owned it.
Please be unlocked.
It was. Two hands grabbed her around the waist and hefted her up through the doorway. Then Brodrick gave her a little shove and climbed in behind her as smooth as a cat, like he took giant steps like that 100 times a day. He closed the door gently, then followed her to the back. They stepped inside the tiny bathroom, locked the door and waited. When they braced themselves with a hand on the miniature sink and another on the wall, they were face to face all over again. She started to turn around, but he stopped her with a warm hand on her elbow. "Dinna move about, lassie. The caravan shakes with but a deep breath. They'll ken we're inside." She breathed deeply and flared her nostrils, making it clear she wasn't happy to stand close to him again, and that his brogue wasn't going to affect her any more. "Come now, spit it out. How have I ruffled those lovely tail feathers, With a single finger, he stroked the edge of her collarbone and sent shivers through her. When he realized it made the trailer shake, he grimaced an apology and put his hand behind his back.
I don't think you should be touching me when you obviously have a girlfriend out there somewhere.
He gave her a crooked grin. "Obvious, is it? How is that?" She could have sworn his muscles swelled like he was showing off, or maybe he was so full of himself he was having a hard time containing it.
You said a girl paid for your flight. That's a lot of money to spend unless you're expecting something in return.
He pressed his mouth against his bulging bicep and tried to quiet his laugh. She tried to turn again, but froze at the sound of the trailer door opening. The RV shook as someone climbed inside. After a dozen rattles and rolls, the trailer stilled again, the door slammed shut, and the truck started up. Flooded with relief, she relaxed against him before she remembered she was still angry. Before she could step away, though, The tip and jolt of the trailer pulling into the road pinned her where she was. He steadied her with a hand on her back. "Did you happen to notice the license plates?"
No.
"North Dakota," they said. "I believe we are leaving Minnesota." The pickup gathered speed, the ride smoothed, so she pushed away from him again. "Dinna fash, Larkin. I've no girlfriend, no woman paying for my favours."
I didn't say.
"Ye were jealous." With a finger crooked beneath her chin, he forced her to look at him. "Admit it, and I will admit I'm reserving an extra dose of bitterness against Payette for the same reason."
The same reason? He was jealous?
She needed a minute to take that in. Someone who regularly had women swooning at his feet liked her enough to be jealous of her former boyfriend. She grinned and threw his own words back at him.
Will wonders never cease?
Chapter 13. Larkin got the distinct feeling that Brodrick wouldn't kiss her again unless she either asked him to or made the first move. But standing up in a moving trailer, waiting for each other to be the first to cave, turned out to be more taxing on her legs than she expected. Besides, she'd gotten tired of watching the little painting swinging hypnotically on the wall above the toilet. Inside the frame were 2 cows in human poses, with names painted in pink on the pockets of their overalls: Elmer and Maribel. She suggested they move to somewhere they could sit down. Since she spoke first, she could see in his eyes that he considered it a win for him. She rolled her eyes to let him know he was wrong. A U-shaped booth with a table filled up the front end of the swaying room, but they agreed it would be smarter to stay close to the bathroom door in case they had to hide again. The kitchen filled the wall opposite the door, which left the rest of the space for 2 twin-sized beds on either side of the walkway to the bathroom. She sat on one bed and pointed to the other side. He chuckled and sat where he was told.
I'm not used to so much.
Touching. Affection. He frowned. "I'm nae surprised." The reminder that Justice had been less than affectionate with her was only slightly less painful than the fact that he'd thrown her onto the biggest bus possible. Of course, in the back of her mind, Jiminy Cricket was defending a little sliver of hope that there had been some misunderstanding, and that somewhere Justice was defending her, pleading her case, and planning to testify on her behalf if it came down to that. Then she remembered that awkward silence on the deputy's radio, when he'd mentioned her name and Justice bit his head off. Jiminy stuck his fat fingers in his ears and closed his eyes. Brodrick watched her closely but said nothing. She didn't want to discuss Justice with him, so she turned the magnifying glass back on his life.
So why did this girl pay her way to the States?
He shrugged, his gaze suddenly shrouded. "Her name is Sansaray. She didn't pay for anything, at least not with coin." He frowned. "I worry what it will cost her in the end, her tinkering with souls." Larkin could tell she'd lost his attention, but she let him take his time. Whoever this Sansaray was, it sounded like she was living a pretty shady life, and if Larkin was told too much about it, she might feel compelled to help the girl. At the moment, though, she didn't know how she could even help herself.
Hopefully. We have hours before Elmer and Maribel have to stop for gas again. Maybe we should try to get some sleep.
He frowned again. "Elmer." He glanced toward the bathroom. "Oh, I see you meant our hosts."
Yeah.
She laid back on the pillow, covered in a crisply ironed pillowcase, and stretched her legs out.
So how are we going to get anyone to believe that Justice killed Robert?
You believe me then?
It would be a hell of a lot easier if I didn't.
He nodded and leaned back against the wall with his hands behind his head and stared at the cupboard above her. If we are to prove Payette's guilt, we must do so quickly before I'm taken away.
You mean we? Before we are taken away?
Nay, lass. Sonny will summon me back to her very soon. We have perhaps a day to accomplish what we can, and I feel that fleeing might have been a mistake.
Our number one goal right now is to stay alive, okay? In fact, it should be goals 1 through 10. Any justice we might find will be all gravy.
Yeah, any justice they find. Anything better than just staying alive. Living and breathing for another day was going to be a miracle. Her career was over if she couldn't clear herself. But she wasn't about to let some innocent foreigner get turned into bloody Swiss cheese just so she could go back to her tepid life. She remembered something he said and put her elbows beneath her so he could see her scowl.
Wait, you said summon you back? I don't understand. If your face is on any watch list, you won't be able to get on an airplane.
Nay, lass. He lowered his chin and gave her a sober look she didn't care for. I believe it's time we talked about that witch, aye. She laughed, but ended up snorting and covering her face with one hand.
That witch you pretended you never mentioned?
Aye, the very same. You see, Sonny is that witch. She's a wee lass who used her power to send me here, that I might prove myself worthy of some heavenly reward, or so she implied.
You mean a witch?
She chuckled.
Magic spells and pointy hats?
He scowled. Sonny wears no hat, but I, a witch. Larkin sat up and leaned forward across the aisle.
This isn't maybe a Scottish or Highland term for some harmless profession? Maybe she's just a life coach or something, suggesting you to turn your life around.
He barked with laughter. A life coach? I shall tell her you suggested it. But nay, she gave me no coaching. Told me to hold tight to my weapon and sent me through the darkness of the universe to land in Minnesota of the United States. Life coach indeed. He laughed again. Larkin shook her head, trying to get a grip, but the only clear thought within reach was the possibility that she had most likely run off with a mental patient after swallowing his story hook, line and sinker, that he hadn't killed the man. The sheriff who arrested him had.
Holy cow.
The trailer swayed slightly, probably because Elmer was changing lanes, but it was enough to throw her off balance, and she lurched forward. A cabinet door slammed overhead at the same time she heard the clank of glass breaking. Hands splayed, she tried to catch herself so she didn't faceplant in Brodrick's lap, but he shoved her to the side, then sucked in his breath. She quickly got her feet under her and looked back to find a large triangle of yellow, textured glass jutting up out of the man's forearm. Blood gushed around it to drip down his skin. But then it stopped. The blood stopped and flowed back into the wound like he existed in some movie and someone had pressed the rewind button. While she watched in total shock, he grimaced and pulled the glass from the deep gash, the gash that closed as soon as the glass was out. Instinctively she reached out to touch the screen that had to be between them, that must be separating her from the familiar man in the movie, but instead she touched that arm, the whole, healthy, warm and hairy arm. The movie faded to black. Chapter 14. Look, there you are. Easy now. Didn't try to sit up just yet, Darcy.
The voice was from a dream. Had to be. Only she'd never really dreamed about being rescued by a Scotsman before.
Oh, correction, Highlander.
It all came flooding back to her, and eventually her memory got around to explaining why she was currently bumping along inside a large camping trailer. And it ended at the moment Brodrick pulled a piece of yellow glass out of his arm.
Oh no, no.
A heavy hand pressed against her shoulder, preventing her from sitting up. A wet washcloth that smelled very strongly of bleach lay on her forehead, and water trickled into the outer curves of her ear. Brodrick's hip pressed tight against her thigh as he tried to fit on the narrow bed beside her, but he seemed oblivious. Or maybe he was trying to get back at her for not believing him about the witch. The question was, how much time had passed?
How long?
An hour, perhaps a wee longer. After haunting this earth for nigh 300 years, I'm a mite rusty at guessing the passage of time, as ye can imagine. As she could imagine. Haunting. Now he was telling her he was a ghost.
Oh no, no.
Forgive me. He lifted the cloth off her head and wiped the little trail of water from the side of her face. I should allow ye to sleep. It was a tender gesture. She couldn't remember the last time someone had been tender with her. A foster mother from her early years, maybe.
I don't need to sleep,
she said, and tried to sit up again. Nay, lass, I think it best ye remain where ye are. I fear ye might faint again when ye come to believe you're sitting beside a ghostie.
A ghostie?
Well, I suppose I am in mortal form at the moment, but not mortal as ye bore witness. I would have spared ye such details, but I couldn't have sat idly by while glass rained down on your head, aye. He smiled a devious smile. Piet shot me point blank to be certain I was dead. Can ye imagine how alarmed he must be to have me live to tell the tale? It's no wonder he wished to lock me away.
Why? Why did he shoot you?
She wanted to deal with the easier details first. Of course it wasn't easy to hear you've been dating a man capable of murder, but it was a lot more rational than talking about ghosties and witches, with or without pointy hats. Close range, as they say. He pointed to a spot on his wide chest, impressive even though she couldn't see much definition beneath his dark t-shirt. He seemed to be waiting for her to check for a bullet hole or something. So she did. She reached out and dragged 2 fingers over the spot he'd indicated. Nothing there, just warm, firm skin under strained cotton. When she held her fingers still, she could feel the thump of his heart. She imagined a bullet pushing through fabric or animal skin, pressing deep into his body, then popping back out again, the hole disappearing.
Well, your heart's still beating,
she said, a lot breathier than she'd wanted. Mopping her head, Jiminy rolled his eyes and slapped his forehead. Aye, it is, and for another day or more it will continue to do so. Only... He bit his lips together and frowned while he folded and unfolded the washcloth, leaving a wet patch on his denim-covered knee.
Only...
He nodded. Only I failed my task. I arrived too late to save that man, and because of this we've ended up here with your life in jeopardy as well. I've no ken how much time I'll be allotted to set things right.
We're talking about that witch again?
She was glad she was still lying down, just in case. Aye, I was sent to that alley for a reason, to save the poor sod ye call Robert, but Piet had already killed him. He was standing over another man, forcing him to dig the bullet back out again. When they saw me, Piet shot me and I went down. Perhaps because I expected to. I'd no idea at the time that I couldn't be killed, you see. He took my sword and hacked at the body, no doubt to disguise the bullet wound and the mess they'd made of it. It was not unlike the things that were done on the field of Culloden after the battle that was lost. His focus drifted along with his voice, and Larkin didn't want to intrude on his private thoughts. She suspected he might have PTSD, but she would have to hear more to be sure. She desperately wished she could help him by doing more than just helping him escape. But could she really help a man who might or might not have been a ghost? The hiss of cars passing by told her it had started to rain. She pictured the faces of passengers staring at the road, singing with the radio, going on with their lives, oblivious to the impossible, unnatural things that had happened inside the trailer next to them. She was jealous of that oblivion. She'd entered some twilight zone where the world conspired to drive her insane. Betrayed by her boyfriend, hunted by the police, and now tricked by the universe into believing that the one man she needed to trust was somehow immortal. No wonder she passed out. At least her body was trying to protect her. She took the wet cloth from him, draped it over her eyes, and concentrated on breathing slow and steady.
I'm so sorry if you've lived through such gruesome things before. Tell me about this battle and what happened after it. I promise I'm listening.
Though she didn't want to hear bloody details, she hoped it would help him to speak about it. April 16th, 1746, the Battle of Culloden Moor. He drew his finger along her arm as he spoke, like he was painting the details as he remembered them. A short, passionate, mismatched battle that didn't last long, and afterward no quarter given. He hissed and got to his feet, leaving her arm and the space beside her cool and bereft. Though the trailer swayed a little, he paced to the front end and back again. Since he wasn't there to stop her, she sat up.
What does that mean, no quarter given?
He stopped, his expression fierce, but that fierceness was not aimed at her. She felt no danger. It means no mercy. The wounded were murdered where they lay. Those fleeing the battlefield were hunted and slaughtered, sometimes in front of their families, sometimes along with them. Those who surrendered were imprisoned, then hanged or transported. Few were pardoned outright. He suddenly laughed. Listen to me, sounding like a blithering tour guide. Larkin had no choice but to believe him. The scientist in her head had to know how he'd been able to take that glass out of his arm and immediately heal. As a psychologist, she wanted to know if she could help him through the torment he obviously carried around with him. And the woman in her had to know why he might be taken away from her at any minute. It took all her willpower not to throw her arms around him and refuse to let him go. They quite literally didn't make them like that anymore. She supposed it was possible that it was all just an elaborate prank, that his arm hadn't really healed itself and he wasn't a 300-year-old Scottish ghost. He could just be a guy who fought in the Middle East, and the horrors he'd experienced were even worse than this bit of Scottish history, if it was an actual battle, and by talking about another bloody battle, he was able in some way to speak aloud of his own experience. A form of transference, but instead of a relationship, it was a memory he had transferred onto her. But even Jiminy Cricket was waving a plaid flag to tell her which scenario he was buying.
I'm sorry,
she said.
It sounds too horrible to bear.
He nodded, turned as if he intended to start pacing again, then came back to sit beside her. She scooted over to give him room, couldn't help noticing how his warmth and his weight on the mattress was very real. "You're right about that. Too horrible to bear. And I suppose that is why the 79 couldn't have seemed to let it all go. We woke the day after, one at a time. I was the 62nd to rise."
Is that significant?
He shrugged off the question, but she was sure he was trying to downplay how important that number was to him. She had to know why.
Brodrick, tell me.
He took a deep breath that filled his lungs and lifted his chest, and as she watched, his eyes reddened. When he finally spoke, his voice was hushed, and she had to lean close to hear him clearly. Culloden Moor is hallowed ground, but it can be a disturbing place, even for the ghosts who wander above and below the surface. When one amongst us has a bad turn, a waking nightmare you might say, our memories of our pasts peek through the fog to break our hearts all over again. The horn blows. He shuddered, but didn't seem to notice. Not Gabriel's horn, mind ye. A bugler, ghostly white and as dead as the 79, comes when he is needed. He serves us for some reason. When he calls assembly, we step into formation and count off. It reminds us that we're not alone in our isolation, that the others have not left us, that we are many, and we are united in our outrage.
Ghost roll call?
Aye, roll call, by the numbers, you see, and I am number 62. Years have gone by, all at a go sometimes, with need for only our numbers, not our names. From time to time, some forget those names, and no wonder. But they remember them again eventually. Nothing can bring a man panic like forgetting his own name.
I can imagine.
Can ye? She nodded.
I've met hundreds of patients through the years that have had panic attacks. Forgetting something as trivial as where they park their car can spark an episode, kind of like hyperventilating.
He smiled. Aye, that is just it. Ghostly Highlanders with the occasional panic attack.
Have you ever panicked and had to call the bugler?
Yeah, she was drinking the Kool-Aid, but she wasn't about to let doubt shut him down just when he was opening up. Aye, and no. We all needed reassurance from time to time in the early years, but we never summoned the bugler. He simply knew to come. Once we stepped into the 19th century, over 50 years after the battle, those panic attacks, as ye call them, came less frequently. There was so much to distract us then, on those rare days when we chose to wake and observe the living. And we Rabbi, a young lad among our number, needed assembly called more often than most, understandably. His dog was not always a sufficient comfort.
A boy? How heartbreaking.
Look, he wasn't the only lad to fall at Culloden, mind. There was many a woman and child that fought and fell that April day, but Robbie was the only laddie to rise with us afterward.
How can you stand it, knowing there's a little boy's ghost out there?
Her heart was breaking at the image her mind had painted. Brodrick patted her knee. Wheesht now, Robbie's nae longer on the moor. He was one of those Shawnee sent on first. She's a soft-hearted lass, like ye. Larkin snorted.
I'm not soft. You have to be fairly callous to be a psychologist. You can't internalize...
You're a soft lass, and it's a fine thing for a woman to be. She was pretty sure he wasn't talking about her heart, since he was currently staring at her lips. But in order to keep their conversation from dissolving into a make-out session and leaving her with unanswered questions, she stood up and stretched her legs.
You make it all sound so believable.
She pointed to the broken piece of glass, still sitting on the other bed, without a trace of blood on it.
I really can't deny what I saw for myself. But you have to be patient with me. I never believed in fairy godmothers, never believed in anything supernatural. I don't even believe in—
She grimaced at what she was about to say. Ghosties. She bit her lip and nodded. And yet yesterday you didn't believe that Piet was an evil man. Now you believe. 'Tis the same adjustment you must make when you learn anything new. Just because you held on to your belief for a great while doesn't mean you cannot change your mind. And it doesn't mean that everything you believe beforehand can't be true as well. For instance, just because you now believe in ghosts doesn't mean you must believe in werewolves. She quickly checked his expression, worried. He laughed. Nay, lass, so far as I ken, they're only fantasy. She narrowed her eyes.
And zombies?
He laughed and shook his head, lifted an arm and invited her to sit beside him again. When she did, he hugged her shoulder and pulled her into him. I ken it's difficult to swallow. After all, it was only this morning ye had to give up the notion that the world is flat. They both laughed at the reference to their earlier argument, but their laughter was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. Chapter 15. Larkin jumped to her feet and hurried to the table. The trailer's booth seats were filled with sturdy apple boxes full of groceries, paper supplies and kitchen gadgets. She had to find the phone before it stopped ringing. "I canna mean to answer it," Brodrick said from behind.
No, but we can use it to check the news if it's not locked.
She found it stuffed down the side of a box full of dish towels and washcloths. A smartphone, thank goodness. She swiped the ignore option, which ended the call without answering it.
Full battery.
They took it back to the bed and sat. It took her a minute to find a Minneapolis station's website. It was just after 10 a.m. She chose a live feed that took her right to the news. For a few seconds she couldn't hear, too stunned by the face on the screen. It was her own. The picture was one Justice had taken with his cell. A slight frown made her look like she wasn't quite bright.
Also considered dangerous.
The newswoman said.
Dr. Nash is a local psychologist who law enforcement claims was seduced by the Scottish suspect when she was called to Lottery Medical Center to evaluate him. They say Dr. Nash not only helped the man escape custody, but has remained with the suspect as a willing hostage. We should have a short clip for you soon of the good doctor at Walmart this morning buying clothes for the suspected cop killer. She is now considered his equally dangerous accomplice.
The woman tried to remain sober, but the smile that pulled up one side of her lips suggested she thought it was pretty funny.
Maybe they'll change the term Stockholm Syndrome to Scottish Syndrome. Brian?
The shot switched to the male anchor, who was also trying to control his smile.
I can't believe Justice would just kick me out to the curb like this.
Larkin.
What?
Look at me. She rolled her eyes and turned her head.
Apparently I spent too much time looking at you back at the hospital. A whole 2 minutes I looked at you. And that was all it took, I guess, to be seduced.
She gestured toward his body, like a new prize on The Price is Right, and suddenly forgot what she was going to say. She rolled her eyes again and turned back to the phone screen before she said, or did, something she might regret.
We have Sheriff Justice Payette of Mille Lacs County standing by at the hospital where they have set up search headquarters for the area between the hospital and North Long Lake. Sheriff Payette, is it true that Dr. Larkin Nash was once your girlfriend?
Larkin's heart stopped, and an intense ache radiated out from somewhere beneath her collarbone. Justice hadn't opened his mouth yet, but the disgust on his face was enough to make her flinch. "It's true," he said. "I dated Larkin Nash up until about a month ago." Larkin grunted.
We didn't break up. He had meetings.
I couldn't say what her mental state was last night when she was called into the hospital. It's not known at this time whether or not she knew the suspect prior to the murder of Sheriff Robert Reiser, but she and Reiser did know each other. Whether or not she hired the mental patient to kill the sheriff is a possibility we're looking at. The suspect pretended not to speak English, but thanks to Walmart footage, we see they're obviously able to communicate, so we believe that it was all an act on his part.
How well did you know Sheriff Reiser?
The newswoman asked. But Larkin's ears were pumped so full with blood she couldn't hear anything more. She watched Justice's lips move, read the disgust on his face, but heard nothing more. She jumped when Brodrick's hand rested on her shoulder, but she was too embarrassed to look at him again. He knew the truth, that she'd been forced to go along with him, not seduced into helping him escape. But then she thought about that moment in the elevator when he'd told her to move away from the door, and she'd done it. Instead of running from him, she'd gone along, showed him an escape route. No wonder Justice thought. "Bastard," Brodrick hissed at the screen. "Since I have had ample time to convince ye of the truth, he must ensure that no one will believe anything ye say." He suddenly jumped to his feet with his hand out as if to protect her. "Larkin, the trailer has stopped." They'd been so focused on the news, they hadn't noticed. The trailer door swung open. The wet, fresh smell of rain flooded through the doorway, but no one appeared. "Come on out," a man said. "Keep your hands where we can see him." Chapter 16. Brodrick held out his hand, commanding her to stay put. Then he moved toward the opening.
Not a chance,
she said, and joined him. He grunted and tried to keep her behind his back. She strained to see what was waiting for them. The driver of the pickup stood about 5 feet back, his hand on the collar of a pit bull, a long, sleek animal with the colouring of a mountain lion. Larkin had been expecting a gun. "Yeah," the man said loudly. "It's them. Make the call."
Wait!
She lunged around Brodrick and stood in front of him.
We're being framed by the sheriff of Mille-Lacs County. Please don't call the police.
The pit bull snarled and barked so viciously it gave her the chills, but it stayed put even though it was barely restrained. Its owner looked toward the front of the vehicle. "Hang on!" He turned back to Larkin and glanced over her shoulder. "Mad, take it you're not his hostage." She shook her head.
Not anymore.
"Weapons?"
No.
"Yes." Brodrick shifted behind her, then reached over her shoulder and tossed something. After a loud smack, the handle of a small knife protruded from the short grass 3 feet to the right of the dog. The man's wife walked into view and over to the dog. She squatted next to it and told the animal to be quiet. It calmed instantly. Her eyes widened when she looked over Larkin's shoulder.
Wait till you see the rest of him. We're sorry we broke into your trailer,
Larkin told her.
We were desperate.
The man glanced at his wife. "It's your call, honey." Larkin was tempted to duck back inside so the woman could get a clearer picture of Brodrick, but she didn't dare move, like standing in the teleporter on Star Trek, trying to hold completely still so she came out all right on the other side. The rest of her life was being determined by something completely out of her hands.
I think it's time for lunch,
the woman said, then straightened and brushed her hands together.
Let's get out of this drizzle.
A half-hour later, the 4 of them were seated around the table, eating sandwiches and chips and drinking orange soda, which Brodrick said looked a lot like iron brew, something they drank in Scotland. Elmer asked, "Does it taste the same?" Brodrick lifted his shoulders in a shrug. "I've never had the pleasure." Mary Bell exhaled in a quiet sigh. She was a surprisingly kind woman who had fixed 4 plates while the rest of them relocated the boxes of supplies to the beds. She stayed relatively quiet and unobtrusive while Larkin and Brodrick told them about the past 12 hours. But each time Brodrick spoke, Mary Bell's head would turn his way so she could watch his mouth. Apparently, Larkin wasn't the only woman in Minnesota who was affected by his brogue. When the Highlander hadn't anything more to say, Mary Bell turned to her.
So, you're a doctor?
She shook her head.
Just in psychology.
The woman frowned.
Just? Well, I'm not out here transplanting hearts or anything. Did you want to transplant hearts?
Larkin laughed.
No. I guess I didn't. I grew up in the foster system, and I knew I'd have to take care of myself. And for me, that meant I needed money.
Brodrick got a funny look on his face, then focused on his food again. She ignored it for the moment and went on.
I thought my best bet was a medical career. But needles aren't my thing, so I chose something cleaner. Fewer plastic gloves required. Was there something else you wanted to do? Oh, not really. I like the idea of helping people. As a teen, I was taken to a psychologist a few times who helped me find some perspective. And if I could do that for other people, I figured I could contribute a little.
She turned her soda can and played with the little drops, condensing on the sides of it.
I don't know if I'll get a chance to practice now.
Brodrick's hand reached over to squeeze one of hers, and they exchanged an awkward smile. Elmer cleared his throat. "So, what are you gonna do now?" Brodrick frowned. "Seek justice."
Stay alive.
They'd spoken at the same time. She gave him a frown.
I don't know if we can do both.
"And I say I canna leave you behind until I ken the bastard is caught." While they'd argued, Mary Bell answered her phone. Her daughter had been the one to call earlier, which had led Larkin to find the phone. The girl had then called Elmer's phone, which is why they'd stopped, so Mary Bell could be sure she hadn't lost hers. They'd been listening to the news on the radio, so when they heard voices inside the trailer, they feared the worst. The pit bull, named Abigail, but lovingly called Abigail, was their only weapon. When the dog didn't go crazy, she could have fooled Larkin. Mary Bell decided to trust them. Abigail, as it turned out, was a calm, clever dog that seemed to understand every word her owners said. The woman was quick to assure her daughter the phone had been found and they had just stopped for lunch. She omitted the fact that they were sharing their meal with the fleeing suspects from the news. The couple agreed to take them as far as North Dakota, but she and Brodrick were both reluctant to drag their new friends into their troubles.
You and Elmer could go to jail,
Larkin pointed out. Her comment led to an entire discussion about where the name Elmer had come from. They were good sports about it, and for the rest of the meal, the two called each other Elmer and Mary Bell every chance they got. "Don't you worry about us," Elmer said. "We're not the types to hide our heads in the sand." Before getting back on the road, they listened to the news again. There was a roadblock about 10 miles from where they were, and no way to evade it without turning around and heading back. Mary Bell found Larkin a change of clothes, just in case, so the two of them could ride in the pickup while Elmer and Brodrick stayed in the trailer. If the cops insisted on looking in the RV, Elmer would distract them from searching the bathroom, where Brodrick would hide with the dog. Unaccountably, Abigail refused to leave the Highlander's side,
which everyone found charming. To Larkin, however, it was a reminder of everything supernatural about the man she had come to care too much for. For a good hour, she'd been able to forget, to pretend they were just two couples sharing lunch and stories. But reality, or rather surreality, stared her in the face again. Maribel opened the door and climbed down the steps. Larkin made it to the door, but turned around to look at Brodrick.
I don't know about this. I mean, we haven't been separated for, what, hours?
She laughed lightly, but it hadn't really been a joke. She was experiencing separation anxiety and wanted to acknowledge it somehow. Elmer laughed with her, but Brodrick was sober as a judge. He closed the few feet of space between them, put his hand behind her head, and pulled her up to meet his mouth. It was exactly what she'd needed. Nothing else mattered any more. If they could stand there until the witch called him back, she wouldn't complain. In fact, Elmer cleared his throat again, and Brodrick finally ended the kiss, whether she wanted him to or not. "We'd better get moving," the man said. "We don't want the police stopping to check on us now, do we?" Brodrick's hand slid down her arm as she turned and climbed down the steps. She could still feel the tingle of contact while she waited for Maribel to fold up the stairs. Once they were on the road, the woman called her husband's phone and told him she would leave it on speakerphone so the men could hear anything that was said by the police. And that little suggestion got Larkin to thinking. Maybe there was a way to expose justice for the murderer he was. Chapter 17. They'd gone a couple of miles down the highway when Larkin heard the deep rumble of men's voices on the phone. Maribel reached over and turned up the volume. Elmer was speaking. "And you never went home afterward?" "I couldn't, too ashamed. I took them into donating every penny they had to the cause, pennies they could ill afford, and when the fight was lost, they were left with nothing at all. I might as well have held a gun to their heads and robbed them blind. As it was, the clan never recovered." He was referring to the battle he'd died in. Was he crazy? He couldn't just tell anyone he'd recently been a ghost. He'd get locked up whether he killed someone or not. "Oh, come on now. There's nothing wrong with dedicating your heart and soul to something. It's how great things are done. It's how great things are changed." Aye, but I'd no right to dedicate their very lives to something they didn't believe in. There was a short pause. "I'm sure your family has already forgiven you. All you need to do is give them a chance to tell you that." Brodrick laughed. "Sir, you've no ken how many years I've been trying to avoid that very conversation." Larkin relaxed. It sounded like Elmer didn't know what century Brodrick was talking about. "What about the girl?" Larkin glanced at Maribel, and without a word they agreed to leave the speakerphone on. Maribel even turned down the air conditioner so they could hear better. "I've begrudged her. I've judged her for the spoilt American I assumed she was." The square lump in her pocket felt like 10 pounds sitting against her hip bone. "But I'm ashamed. As it happens, the lass has a good heart. I kenned it the moment she stepped into that small room to try and calm everyone down, no doubt hoping to keep any of us from getting hurt. But I'd already made up my mind to take her away from the bastard, if only to put a thistle in his breeches." Both men laughed at that, but she could feel a thistle getting lodged in her own chest, hearing that he'd only taken her along to get back at justice. Maybe that kiss on the second floor had been all about justice too. The one on the hillside was probably just to prove he was in charge.
The kiss on Paul Bunyan Trail might have been his way of making sure she'd come back. She was even gladder she hadn't let him kiss her behind the trees. But what about that bruising kiss just before she'd left him in the trailer? If he hadn't meant that one either, her heart might actually shatter like an old plate with lots of sentimental value. Impossible to repair, impossible to replace. She faced the window in case Mary Bell was good at reading expressions. She wanted to turn down the volume just as much as she wanted to hear what he would say next, even though it might be painful. "And how do you feel about her now?" The pause that followed Elmer's question was long enough to sting. When I first laid eyes on the lass, it was through a small window. In spite of her being friendly with my enemy, she stole my breath as if God himself had whispered in my ear. "This lass was made for ye alone, Brodrick Shaw. And I've been trying to catch my breath back ever since. It seems I can only breathe easy when I'm kissing her, though I must sound quite daft." "Not at all, not at all. My Mary Bell affects me the same way." Hundreds of brake lights flared up ahead. The pickup slowed. Mary Bell picked up the phone.
Elmer? Are you there? Can you hear me?
She gave Larkin a sly wink. "Yes, Mary Bell, I can hear you."
I think we're coming up on the roadblock.
"All right, we'll be ready." Mary Bell was a brilliant actress. If anyone in the world had a gift for lying, it was that sweet, quiet woman from North Dakota. When they got up to the front of the line, an officer motioned for her to pull over to the side. But instead of complying, she rolled down the window and motioned for him to come to her. He shook his head and motioned to the side of the road. Mary Bell waved again for him to come to her. Finally, he gave up and came to the window.
Have I done something wrong?
She asked innocently. "No, ma'am. We just have to check every vehicle that comes through. We've got some fugitives on the loose and—"
I keep my trailer locked up tight. I promise I do. But I also keep Abigail locked in there so other drivers don't see her and get upset.
The officer frowned and pointed again. "I'm going to need you to pull over."
Abigail is our pit bull, you know.
"You have a pit bull in your trailer, ma'am?"
Yes, sir. But don't worry, she won't get hurt. She usually lays in the bed, you know, to avoid her motion sickness. And I'll tell you, if some fugitive tried to break into the trailer, he would change his mind real quick, especially if the dog's been sick.
The officer looked back at the trailer for 10 long seconds, then tugged on the front of his hat. "Don't worry about it, ma'am. You just go on ahead."
All right, I appreciate that, and good luck catching your fugitive.
"Yes, ma'am." They were a good 2 miles away before Larkin felt safe to celebrate. She and Mary Bell started laughing, and soon heard the men whooping and hollering through the phone.
Maribel, you were brilliant,
she said.
Why, thank you. I thought the dog getting sick was a nice touch. Did you see his face turn green? I didn't think the pit bull was going to dissuade him, but you pushed him over the edge.
Larkin sobered.
And maybe what I need to do is push someone else over the edge.
She picked up the phone.
Brodrick, I have an idea.
Chapter 18. 3 hours later, Larkin and Brodrick stood in the far north corner of Leisureland RV, a trailer dealership in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, on the border with North Dakota. They had just said their goodbyes to the kind-hearted couple with whom they'd become good friends simply because a dog had deemed Brodrick and her harmless.
Wait a minute.
She waved her hand, and Elmer stopped the truck.
You never told us what your real names were.
Elmer laughed. McIntyre. Then he winked. Elmer and Maribel McIntyre.
They pulled through the lot into the road and out of their lives. Brodrick stepped behind her and pulled her back against him. It was probably better that she couldn't look at him now that he'd changed back into his kilt. She might forget what she was supposed to do. "Before this begins, lass, I wish to see something." He didn't let her turn around. "I dinna ken when I will be called away. I only hope I'm able to see this through before Sonny gives up on me, but I wish to be clear about how I feel about ye." Thankfully, she had reason to believe she would like what he had to say, but her heart ached at the reminder that he would be leaving her soon if, in fact, it wasn't just a crazy dream. But a crazy dream would mean that a handsome Highlander had never really swept her off her hospital socks in the first place, and that would be sadder still. "Lift your face, lass. I would like very much for ye to feel the rain, aye." She nodded and obeyed. Minuscule drops that evaporated as soon as they hit her skin felt like tiny kisses on her eyelids, her cheeks, her mouth. "Now, imagine," he continued, "that after this day ye shall never feel the rain. Ye might stand in it for nigh on 300 years and only watch it fall through ye, but never feel its kiss." He stood silent for a minute, letting her imagine the unending torture he would have gone through, and not just because of the rain. "Know then that this is how bereft I will feel without ye, to never feel your hand wrapped in my own, never feel the press of your lips. No matter where I'm bound, be it heaven or hell, it will be no better than haunting Culloden Moor for another 3 centuries. Larkin laid her arms on top of his where they rested round her waist and squeezed his hands to let him know she'd heard every word. But she was speechless, and though his words made her feel like Cinderella, her prince wouldn't be coming back to look for her. It wouldn't matter if she tucked a glass slipper in the pouch that now hung at the front of his kilt. It wouldn't lead him back to her door. Tears dripped silently down her face, warm streaks that contrasted starkly with the coolness of the rain. Eventually, he turned her. His thumbs smeared the warmth across her cheeks. They both tried to smile. They both failed. Their bodies slammed together in a hopeless, frantic embrace. Headlights flashed as a car pulled into the lot, and reluctantly they stepped apart again. The storm clouds made it seem like late evening, and Larkin thought it reflected her mood perfectly. What she wouldn't give for some strategically aimed lightning. She faced the squad car, sure it was Justice sitting behind the wheel, even though the rain-spattered windshield made it difficult to see. Brodrick stood beside her and held her hand. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Justice said, and shut his car door. He stared at their hands, then at Brodrick. "You work fast, don't you?" Finally, he faced her, expressionless. It was like a punch in the stomach. "Rent said you'd turn the Scotsman in, but only to me." The smirk that blossomed on his face told her all she needed to know, that he was completely aware she intended to lure a confession out of him. She was glad Brodrick held her hand. She worried she might have run away otherwise. Justice made her skin crawl, and in that moment she realized that wasn't the first time. What an idiot she'd been to be so flattered by his attention that she'd never stopped to ask herself if she liked him. Never wondered if the butterflies in her gut were trying to tell her something was wrong.
"When I got the call last night,"
she said,
"the nurse said a sheriff was waiting for an evaluation. I prayed it wasn't you. Do you know why?"
Justice shrugged, like he really didn't care to know, but he'd play along. "No? Why?"
"Because I knew our relationship wouldn't hold up if we had to work together. That you would never be able to give me the respect I deserved."
Brodrick gave her hand a squeeze that Justice couldn't have noticed, but it was enough to let her know he was pleased. Justice rolled his eyes. "We didn't have a relationship, Larkin. I just needed to keep you close to see if you would play ball when the time came."
When the time came?
Justice leaned on the hood of his car and crossed his legs, then pulled out his taser and aimed it at Brodrick. "Yeah, we got a nice little side business going at the mental hospital. Drug testing, organs and whatnot. Rent wanted you brought in as soon as you had your doctorate, but we had to make sure you would play ball first." She gasped. Justice snorted in disgust. "I knew you weren't ready. I tried to get you to just sign an evaluation and go home, but you wouldn't listen. You just had to do an honest evaluation so you could give an honest recommendation. That's when I knew you would be worthless."
Rent?
She brought her free hand to her throat.
Rent is in on this?
"Hell, honey, Rent started it."
Then,
"That's right. Backup's not coming." To Brodrick, he said, "He's the guy who was trying to dig the bullet out of Riser's neck when you wandered into the alley that night." Larkin shook her head.
I thought it was Tommy.
"Tommy," he snorted. "Are you kidding me? You can't trust Tommy with secrets. I don't really trust him with a loaded gun. You'd have been better off to trust him, though." Her head shook in frantic denial.
Why? Why would you kill Robert?
"Robert wanted a bigger share. Said he would expose me to you if I didn't raise his allowance. All those kids of his made him a little greedy." She pointed out the obvious.
And now his kids and Anna have nothing at all.
He widened his eyes in mock surprise. "You haven't been watching the news. I've set up a trust fund for those brats out of the goodness of my heart." He laughed. "And it's costing me a fraction of what Robert was getting from me before." He sobered and pushed his hat to the back of his head. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking it doesn't matter that you called the wrong guy because you've been streaming our little conversation live to the internet with some webcam, but you're wrong." She bit her lips together. "I don't need to know where your camera is, baby. I've got a little contraption that jams all signals for 100 square feet. Oh," he clicked his fingers, "another thing." The back door of the squad car opened, and the familiar and once beloved form of Felix Rentmeister got out. He looked a little ill, like he regretted betraying her, but how remorseful could he be if he was carrying a long Scottish sword that shimmered along the sharp edge?
I can't believe this,
she whispered, then choked on very real tears.
We've been the best of friends.
The best? Come on, Larkin. If you knew me so well, you wouldn't be so surprised now. You know all I care about is the money.
That's not true.
Oh, believe me, it is. I've just got blessed with an innocent, sincere face, that's all. He walked in a wide circle around her, his attention on Brodrick. You know the way you talked about having real money someday. I thought you'd be the perfect addition to the team. You might have brought a fresh stream of income from your clinic, and Riser's position was about to open up. Justice pushed off the hood, moved the taser to his left hand, then pulled out his gun and aimed it at her. Here's what's going to happen. Since bullets don't seem to be effective on you, sir, we're going to shoot Larkin, unless you get down on your knees and take your medicine. Rent laughed and swung the sword around his left side, then his right like a high school baton twirler. Justice aimed at her heart. Do it! Brodrick held out his hands to his sides, fingers spread. And what happens to the lass after? Well, I suppose we take her back to the mental hospital, under an assumed name, of course, and give her some time to come around. Brodrick shook his head. Not nearly good enough. No? Rent moved behind them. What do you suggest?
We confess, the pair of us, into a recording of your choosing. Ye let her go, to run away and hide for the rest of her days, but ye still get to chop off my head. He carefully got down on his knees.
No!
Larkin sidestepped, but the tip of the sword came down to prevent her from reaching Brodrick. Wren taunted. And I don't like the idea of little Miss Honourable lying in wait, coming out of the woodwork some day. I think we'll just end it here. Please leave all other suggestions with the front desk. The doors to 3 trailers burst open and a stream of FBI agents stumbled out. Amidst the shouting, she saw the swirl of light as the blade swung up and around. She jumped in front of Brodrick and tried to block the blow with her shoulder. His big hand shot up and grabbed the blade itself. Blood oozed out between his thumb and forefinger, then disappeared again. A shot rang out. Wren's back arched, and he let go of the hilt. A red dot appeared on his white shirt before he hit the ground. 2 more shots were fired from behind her, from Justice, and she waited for the pain to register. And she waited. The FBI agents froze in their tracks and reminded her of the incident in the parking garage when she caught her shoe on a mat and ended in an awkward pose. It was like that, only the agents held their poses, and held them. She looked around, confused. Justice's gun was still pointed at her, but a little puff of smoke hovered above the tip like a cloud. A girl wearing a long black robe stood beside him, smiling. The dark fabric wavered in the breeze. It was the only thing moving, really. Brodrick shifted his weight. She gave him room and he stood. He frowned at something, and Larkin followed his gaze. She hadn't noticed the 2 bullets hovering in the air 2 feet away.
Hovering. Bullets.
Her brain seemed to wobble like a poorly inflated bouncy ball, and she sensed another faint coming on, but she refused to excuse herself from whatever might be happening. Hovering bullets, no problem.
This is magic. That's all. We like magic. Magic is what keeps Brodrick alive.
Larkin, my love, this wee lass is something today. The girl waved a few fingers.
Excuse me a moment,
she said. Then she stepped close to the hovering bullets, blew on them, then moved next to Larkin. Larkin, however, was looking at the bullets. The points had turned 180 degrees and now pointed at Justice, who never moved a muscle.
Don't worry about the bullets. I had to move quickly, as you can imagine. Lucky for you, I arrived in time.
She gave Brodrick a pointed look. He nodded sheepishly, like he understood what she was talking about. Thank you, lass, for allowing me enough time to clear her name, he said. And for arriving in time to spare her life, of course. The girl chuckled.
The lass saved you both, you silly man. Threw herself in front of a blade to save you. Earned the right to keep you if she cares to.
Larkin swallowed carefully to make sure her ears worked.
I'm sorry, what? Keep him? Aye.
Brodrick looked too scared to move. His eyebrows were frozen high on his forehead, and if it wasn't for the visible heartbeat throbbing in his neck, she would have thought he'd been frozen like the rest. She folded her arms.
As a man or a ghost?
It was Sansare's turn to look surprised.
Pardon? If I keep him, will he stay alive or will he be a ghost again?
Brodrick frowned at her. Would it matter? She couldn't help teasing. It helped her deal.
The rain, remember? I don't want you to spend another 300 years missing the rain.
Sonny nudged her.
His days of haunting are over. His freedom from those chains have been bought and paid for.
She bit her lip for a second and gave Larkin a sly wink.
If you don't want him, though, he can move on. I want him.
Her voice didn't carry like she expected it to. It was like they were standing in a little closet. Nothing echoed. They couldn't even hear the rain, even though it seemed to be falling all around them. Her own insecurity wasn't an easy thing to overcome, however, so she had to ask.
But does he want me?
The Highlander in question swept her knees out from under her, and she threw her arms around his neck out of instinct. Do I want ye? He shook his head, unbelieving. I've wanted ye from the first moment, Dr. Larkin Nash. You were meant to be mine all along. I should have had faith that it would be so. They kissed, they laughed, then kissed again. The girl waited patiently for them to remember her. Brodrick put her back on her feet. Pardon me, Sonny.
Your joy is my joy, Brodrick Shaw. I have awaited this moment, hoping it would come for you as it has for others. You're free now.
She wiped tears from her face with both hands.
But it is time to say farewell. Give us a kiss, number 62. Your brothers in arms await their own rewards.
He kissed her once on each cheek, then sobered. But Sonny, I failed.
You're a daft man. Look around you. I required a noble deed. Never did I say you couldn't have help.
She waved him back.
Return to your knees, if you would. And Larkin, back where you were. Like I said, don't mind the bullets.
With Brodrick's head nice and low where she could reach it, Larkin couldn't resist a hasty kiss. She straightened quickly, however, when the air around them erupted in noise again. The echo of those two gunshots made her cover her ears. She turned quickly to see the hovering bullets were gone, but Justice was lying back against the hood, sliding to the ground. 2 red circles bloomed on his chest. Are you hit? Agent Romani asked, and was confused when she shook her head. He looked at Justice. Must have misfired or something. I could have sworn he shot you. I'm sorry we were late. The doors in all 3 trailers jammed, or we would have stopped this much earlier. It could have been a disaster if they hadn't popped open. I'm so glad you're both okay. Worry not, sir. Brodrick was back on his feet. I believe everything happened as it was meant to. Larkin walked around him to stand over the motionless body of her long-time friend and mentor. She was still trying to absorb the fact that he'd been in on it. For 3 hours she'd been remembering little comments he'd made that hadn't made sense to her at the time. Now they were all too clear. When she and Brodrick had talked through the plan with the McIntyres, Brodrick had given a clearer description of Justice's accomplice, and she'd known immediately that it had been Rent and not Tommy. From what Brodrick could remember between tasings, the younger officer had arrived to help move Brodrick's troublesome body into the car after Rent had left the scene. So instead of calling Tommy to get things in motion like she'd first imagined, she'd called Rent and given him the story of the webcam. That got Justice headed for East Grand Forks. Only after Elmer and Mary Bell had introduced them to the owner of the RV dealership did they call the FBI. Agent Romani had acted quickly, and the McIntyres were safely away before trouble could start.
It's my fault,
she told Brodrick.
If I hadn't mentioned money so often, they never would have imagined I could be one of them.
Look, lass, you heard the man. He kenned you were made of honourable stuff, aye. Besides, you now ken the wicked goings-on at the hospital, and so you may rectify it. Imagine all the people you would be helping because of this model. He was right. She needed to remember that. They moved out of the way while an agent began marking the area with yellow tape. Brodrick untucked the sash of his kilt and draped it over both their shoulders and led her to a bench. After a very long day, it was strange to have nothing to do, nowhere to run, no one to run from. She snuggled closer, still in shock that he was allowed to stay at her side, instead of being whisked away by the pretty little witch.
So what now?
Oh, lass, he heaved a sigh. We enjoy the rain. He kissed her nose. We enjoy the rain. Epilogue. Brodrick stood at the opening of the gazebo and waited impatiently for Larkin to appear. He hadn't seen her all day, and he resented the term she'd used for the condition he was in. Separation anxiety. Yes, he was anxious. What man was not anxious on his wedding day? And no, he did not appreciate being separated from the lass every morning when they went off to work, but he refused to use such a common term for what felt wholly uncommon to him, and on top of all else, it was not a work day, and the only thing keeping them apart was a silly custom that dictated he not see her until the ceremony. Well, it was time for the ceremony, and if she didn't show herself in the next 5 seconds, the piper changed his tune to the wedding chant. Brodrick looked anxiously for a lass in white. In the car park stood their new caravan that now had ribbons and cans dangling from the back. Beyond that, a vision in lace emerged from the building and headed his way, bearing a round bouquet of blue flowers and brilliant Scottish thistle. He hadn't thought she liked the blossom in truth. She always got a funny look on her face when he called her his own thistledown, but perhaps he'd been wrong. The wedding was a blur. His head ached from standing too near the piper while he waited for Larkin to appear. But once they'd been sufficiently pelted, with birdseed of all things, and allowed to climb into the sanctuary of their own blessed caravan, he began to think he might survive the day.
Uh-oh.
Larkin pulled out of his grasp and went to the bed, where a gift had been left for them.
Did you do this?
Nay. She turned it over in her hands, her charmingly painted nails flashing with wee jewels she claimed were not real. Finally, she peeled the paper away. The look on her face made him curious, but he waited for her to show him. She grinned and turned the gift so he could see it clearly. 2 cows had been painted in human clothes. When he stepped closer, he saw the names written on their front pockets. Brodrick and Larkin. I suspect I ken just where you'll wish to hang that. Larkin shook her head while she freed her wee veil from her hair.
Surely that can wait, Mr. Shaw.
He moved close in order to help her. Aye, it can at that. She propped one foot up on the bed and lifted the hem of her gown.
Thank you for the shoes. By the way, I don't know how you knew.
He stared at the dull grey, horribly high shoes and cleared his throat to buy him time to choose his response. They'd been no gift from him, but as he watched, a thin stream of green mist swirled behind one heel and disappeared. Larkin hadn't noticed. He took it as a sign he should take credit for them in any case. I'm pleased you like them, he said. This is but the beginning, of course. He took advantage of her precarious balance and pulled her into his arms. I mean to make you grateful every day of our lives. This has been Brodrick, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 23, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Copyright 2015-2016 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.